Welcome to the Law School Insider, where we have conversations with students, lawyers, and employers.
Succeeding in law school is something that you must prepare for, not only before you begin, but throughout your law school journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. I am your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I will draw from my over 20 years of experience in the college admission field, as well as bring forth the experiences of others as we delve deeper into the issues. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Law School Insider. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I'm so excited to have you back again this week. The Law School Insider is a podcast sponsored by Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, and every week we bring you great guests and topics to help you find law school success in your journey into law school, through law school, and beyond. And this week, we are going to be having another great conversation. We're going to be bringing you a presentation that happened at Western Michigan University's Auburn Hills campus. And this was a law review symposium that occurred that spoke on perspectives on mental health. It was called Mental Health, a Michigan Perspective. And it was a very powerful symposium, and it is going to be a longer podcast episode. This episode probably will take about a couple hours. Now, I encourage you to listen in because the expert guests that are a part of this symposium are bringing amazing information to you to help you to think about mental health in a whole new way and the legal parameters and legal perspectives that come into play when you're thinking about mental health and what that means to you as a lawyer and as a person. This is a powerful, powerful podcast that will make you think about things in completely different ways, and I know that you're going to gain a ton from the expert guests that are part of this, as well as the information and resources that are shared. Here is the sharing of the symposium, Mental Health, a Michigan Perspective.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming to this year's WMU Cooley Law Review Symposium regarding mental health. My name is Alicia Warren. I'm the symposium editor for the Law Review. And as you can see, we do have an esteemed panel of speakers here today to kind of discuss their perspectives regarding conflicts in mental health today. Each speaker will be introduced by various Law Review board members. They will talk for roughly 20 minutes regarding their perspective. And then following the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Dean Joan Vestrand. So to get us started, I'd like to invite Dean Vestrand up.
Welcome to our esteemed group of panelists, and thank you to the Law Review for inviting me to moderate this event. I think that the topic that you've selected for today is just so important and so critical. It's so timely and necessary. I think that there are just so many multiple issues that face us in dealing with what is one of our most vulnerable populations. In the research that I did, I found that more than 300,000 people in the state of Michigan have the need for mental health services, and two, that mental health issues are on the rise, that we're in an 80-year upswing with regard to folks suffering from depression and anxiety. And just in the last 10 years, the amount of folks in our communities who suffer from ADD and ADHD has gone up 25%. Autism has also seen a steady increase since the year 2000. You know, a couple weeks ago, there was a big march on the Capitol with hundreds of people from around the state, including people who desperately need these services, because there is a big kind of, I'll call it debate, going on right now in the state of Michigan with regard to how do we fund mental health going forward and what changes can we make. I talked to some of those people. I was here that day and I stopped and chatted with them to try to identify what they see as some of the issues that face us in this state regarding mental health. And I think they're actually national issues. But the kinds of things that they talked about to me was the need for earlier identification of problems and earlier intervention. There's a frustration that we don't have the services out there that are necessary, the pathways to early care and intervention, and that there's not enough care for a variety of reasons. We know that the state psychiatric hospitals have all closed down. These are state funding issues mainly. We know the problems with health insurance coverage and too limited coverage in a lot of the view of the public. Lack of proper support and services in the schools when we have students who are diagnosed with issues at an early time but can't get the services that they need in their schools. And then two, the problem we have when we have, in particular, folks who are undiagnosed or aren't receiving adequate services in self-medicating. And we've got a big problem in this state and across the country with regard to alcohol and drug abuse. And there is a definite connection between mental illness and substance abuse. People who are mentally ill make up 38% of those who abuse alcohol. People who are mentally ill make up 44% of those who abuse cocaine. People who are mentally ill make up 40% of those who rely on cigarettes. So another issue that they talked about was stigma, that they feel stigmatized, that they too also feel so vulnerable that they sometimes at times feel they're purposefully over-medicated to silence their voices and keep them in the shadows because it's an easier way for us to deal with mental illness. So we've got lots and lots of problems, and hopefully with our first speaker, he can talk to us a little bit about this controversial bill right now, 298, which would partially privatize funding for mental health care in Michigan, giving some of that control to Medicaid HMOs. And there are a lot of folks who are dead set against this, and you might hear that on the panel as well. And it'll be interesting for us to come to understand what the controversy is. What does this mean? It could be something that would save the state a lot of money, or maybe not. Would it compromise care? We don't know. It's a trend. It's a national trend. 8 states have gone now to partialization, private funding, and those states include states as close as Illinois and Wisconsin, and involve California, Washington, Florida, South Carolina, New Mexico. So it'll be interesting to see. And Lieutenant Governor Calley is really at the forefront of trying to help moderate this conflict and come up with a solution that best serves the population of Michigan. So welcome to all of our panelists, and I look forward to the question and answer. When it is time for question and answers, I welcome your questions in the audience, and we'll bring them to our panelists. Thank you.
To introduce our first panelist, I'd like to invite our faculty advisor, Professor Mark Cooley.
I finished my law review service in 1991, but they're still going to let me introduce a speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. He was first elected Lieutenant Governor in 2010, and over the course of his career, he's worked tirelessly to ensure that health issues, including mental health issues, get the careful attention that they deserve. He's chaired the Michigan Mental Health and Wellness Commission, the Prescription Drug and Opioid Task Force, the Special Education Reform Task Force, and he leads Michigan's Mental Health Diversion Council. In short, he is a powerful voice for people with mental illness, developmental disabilities, and addiction issues. He's been honored for his leadership by many organizations across the state. I'll name only 2, the Special Olympics of Michigan and the Mental Health Association. So please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Governor Brian Caffey.
Well, thanks for the invitation to be here, and thank you for your attention to such an important issue. As was mentioned, I'd been involved in a lot of different aspects of what I'll generally refer to as brain care. And it really started on a very personal note. Although I grew up in a family that unfortunately have a lot of experience in knowing people that have struggled with addiction issues and some mental health issues as well. When my daughter was born, my second child, my daughter was born in 2006. By the time 2008 rolled around, we knew that something was different. Everything came very hard in terms of their just living life and doing all the things that seemed so easy with our son, the firstborn. And it turned out we learned a few years later, or about a year later, that she had autism. Now, autism, I want to make clear, autism is not a mental illness. It's a developmental disability. Scientifically, there's a big difference, but people with developmental disabilities and people with mental illnesses face a lot of the same societal challenges. And then when you put addiction on top of that, addiction issues which co-occur with mental illnesses and developmental disabilities, very often it really makes it logical for us to address those three issues, addiction, mental illness, and developmental disabilities, together, even though they're not necessarily the same thing. So my experience with my daughter was one that really opened my eyes to just how the world works for people with disabilities. And the conclusion that I came to at that point was that if it was this difficult for somebody as well connected as I am to make all the things happen that need to happen, then the average person would have no chance at all. And so I decided to get more engaged specifically with autism advocacy. What became very, very clear very quickly was that the same challenges were posed by others with different types of developmental disabilities, mental illnesses, and then addiction that co-occurs so often. And so that was the genesis of it. We launched an effort earlier in my term my first term as Lieutenant Governor is called the Mental Health and Wellness Commission. So it was a bipartisan group of people that went around the state and just listened. How's the system working or not working? What's wrong with it? What's missing? Did the same thing years later with special education services as well for many of the same reasons. And what we found was that there were, of course, scope of services, consistency of services, one area to the next, shortages in many professions that are absolutely necessary to provide the type of support that people need. But even in areas where you might have had a more robust support system and people with means to access that system, stigma is still the biggest barrier that we have. It's a barrier to getting out there and living life and being a part of the world, because sometimes when behaviors aren't what we would consider to be normal or typical, the weight of just being a part of the world in that situation can be heavy enough to cause people to really retreat. I can tell you from personal experience, it is absolutely heavy enough to cause people to retreat. And for a couple of years, really, my family stopped having friends, going places, doing things. We just basically, somebody's job was always to be home with our daughter, and somebody else's job was to do the things necessary outside to make life work at home. And so something like going to a grocery store, absolutely out of the question before we had access to the type of support that my daughter needed in order to cope with the world as it is. And so then things like having friends over, absolutely out of the question. Adding a factor like that into my daughter's life was just something that she really couldn't handle in the beginning before we had access to appropriate behavioral care. So that what was really kind of a movement. It was a beautiful thing too, by the way. It was truly grassroots. You had the entire political system opposes changes generally to the insurance code. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left side of the spectrum or the right side of the spectrum. The unions, the business groups, the insurance companies, those are all the big players, by the way. all opposed the changes in 2012 that we did to the insurance code. And we had this group that there's a professor down at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo who prepares board-certified behavior analysts for the profession. His name is Dick Malott. And he has this acronym, POAM, P-O-A-M. Stands for Pissed Off Autism Moms. And we had like an army of poems that just descended on that system and made it respond. I mean, I had never really seen anything like it before, where you had the giants on one side and you had the poems, and some dads too, but mostly poems, that would just descended on the system in a way that it had to respond, it had to listen, and it resulted in change. It was pretty amazing. So out of that came a determination to make change. There's a lot of strong feelings in this area, different philosophies about what the appropriate thing to do is. One I'd like to kind of lay down right now is that I'm 40 years old. I was born in 1977, so I just turned 40. In my lifetime, the greatest advancement in civil rights was closing down the mental institutions in Michigan. The reason why it used to be unusual to see people out and about in communities is because we used to, at a very young age, lock them up and keep them away from society. And so the movement across the country to close down prisons for people with developmental disabilities in particular, that movement is one that expected that our communities would make a place. That was absolutely the right decision. It is a misnomer to say that the people in the mental institutions are now in our prisons. By and large, they are not. People in prisons do have mental illnesses at a higher degree than the regular population, but that is a different group of people than used to be locked up in mental institutions, for the most part. People in that were in mental institutions of the past typically today live successful and supported settings, group homes and things of that nature, which also, by the way, I don't think is good enough, but is definitely a step better than locking them up in what amounts to a prison. So where we failed, though, is equipping our communities to properly care and integrate people into the world. And we've got a lot of work to do in this area. So it's not a matter of, the answer is not segregate them from society, lock them up, and keep them away. It's make a place for them in the community and support them the way that they need to be supported. And so we're making some strides in this area. The other thing I want to point out is that every time something horrendous happens, be a crime, like a horrendous crime, one is hard for us to even imagine how that happens. The first conclusion that people jump to is there must be a mental illness. And this, I just want to make the point that this really does feed the stigma that people with mental illnesses are somehow dangerous. Now, it's true that some people with certain types of mental illnesses that are untreated and of a severe nature, right? So that group of people I described got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to where it's not representative of the entire group. There are some people that pose a danger, and that's why Judge Mack and I did all the work on revising Kevin's law for assisted outpatient treatment, essentially court-ordered treatment in cases where somebody doesn't recognize the need to treat themselves, but they're a danger to themselves or others. That is not the typical person with a mental illness. Most people with mental illnesses live out their lives, and you don't even know. There are people in this room, just by given the size of it, there are people in this room that are treating a mental illness right now and are functioning and productive people contributing to society. Not dangerous at all. And so I just want to make the point that we should never jump to the conclusion that because something bad happened that we don't quite understand, that person must have a mental illness, because that feeds the stigma. It makes people afraid to go out there and seek treatment even when it's accessible, because it is perceived in such a negative way, so different from any other thing. We'd never say to a person who's a diabetic, you should be embarrassed about seeking treatment for your chronic disease. Depression we should treat the exact same way. So health care from the neck up, health care from the neck down needs to be treated the same. A person with a mental illness is far more likely to be the victim of a crime than to be the perpetrator of a crime. So all of that, I don't want to discount, I don't want to say that there aren't criminal justice problems with mental illnesses. I'm just saying that that is not the normal outcome. That is not the typical outcome. A person with a mental illness isn't going to be a danger to society because they have a mental illness. But we will get better outcomes across the board, whether they be severe mental illnesses, moderate or mild mental illnesses, if treatment is available. It will help the criminal justice system, but it'll also just help people that are having a hard time getting by to be more successful in their lives overall. So all that to say, generalization of a disease into one category, saying people with mental illnesses are dangerous, it's just like saying people with cancer are dangerous. It might be that some people with cancer are in fact dangerous. And it might be that some people with mental illnesses are in fact dangerous. But a mental illness does not make you dangerous. That's not a conclusion that we should jump to, because that does feed the stigma. Just a bit on the issues of the day with respect to the budget and who processes the money for behavioral health care. Today we call it carved out. So you have the Medicaid system for physical health care, and for the first 20 visits of mental health care happens just in the Medicaid system. And then after 20 visits, you get technically qualified as having a serious mental illness. If you need more than 20 visits a year, then you fall in the behavioral health system, totally separate. Having a system that's separate, set aside administration for a moment, because all the fight is over administration. Who handles the money, who pays out the money, who manages the contracts, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the service level, managing brain care totally separate from the rest of the body care makes no sense whatsoever. There's pretty good agreement of this across the board. Pretty much everybody agrees to it. The problem is that there is money for brain care and there's money for the rest of your body care, and who gets to make the decisions on that money. That's what the controversy is over right now. Everybody agrees it should be integrated. At the service level where the person is seeking treatment, a medical home model where a person who is treating the neck down knows what the treatment is happening and is kind of integrated in with what's happening for the neck up. That is really important. And if you don't get the brain care right, you will never get the body care right. That's why we see such poor results with in terms of life outcomes and life length for people with serious mental illness. That nothing's coordinated now. This is an absolutely urgent issue. And so while you could make it work with Medicaid HMOs, you could make it work without Medicaid HMOs. Essentially, we have HMOs that the state government controls and it doesn't directly run. There are 10 different organizations around the state that are state directed anyway, governmental or entities called pre-patient inpatient plans, PIHPs. Those organizations they process all the paperwork. They're like a government HMO. So the big controversy is, do you put the government HMO together with the private sector HMOs? Do you just put them all under the same contracts? And would that result in better integration of the actual care at the service level? That's an open question. We started a group about a year ago to evaluate several aspects of the plan. The group that I had served with, really on the front end, on a philosophical basis, just didn't want behavioral health care to be handled by the HMOs. So I can't say that I dug into it to come to a determination that it could work or couldn't work. It's just a matter of this group of advocates that I respect very much didn't feel that that was the way to go, and represented a lot of people that are receiving the care themselves. So it seemed reasonable to me for our administration to put on the table to leave the carve-out in place. The legislature, though, has expressed an interest to varying degrees. I'm trying to integrate these contracts on a pilot basis, and in the case of the Senate, on a pilot basis to start with, but with the goal of total integration in the future. So while I didn't evaluate whether or not that's possible or whether it would work, that part is not really my fight. My fight is no matter who handles the paperwork, no matter who processes the payments. I want less money to go to administration and more money to go to services. It's not acceptable to me that any money is saved that doesn't go to services. If you're going to save it administration and do something else with the money, that's not a good enough answer. Any savings that happens with administration, and by the way, there are plenty of ways that money can be saved, needs to go to services where the bandwidth is not enough today. We have to do more. And I could give you literally dozens of examples of areas where we have to do more. But let me give you one example, one thing that I hope happens. Told you we had 10 PIHPs. So there are 10 different units all around the state. We don't need 10 PIHPs. You could still keep it as a carve-out. You could still not have it be in Medicaid HMOs and just have one PIHP for the whole state. I think you would save about $30 to $40 million if that change was made. I hope that happens. With or without HMO pilots. That's a change that I hope happens. And then that $30 to $40 million, it's about a year to experience those savings, needs to go into services. Where would it go into services? There are a few areas that I think are that I would kind of put at the front end of the critical need list. Direct care workers. People are actually providing the direct care to people, it be in homes or in group home settings and those sorts of things. Right now they're at like, what are they at $9 an hour, Mark? The direct care workers?
Oftentimes, yes.
You can't keep help at that rate. It's actually less than a lot of fast food places are paying right now. We have to do a raise there. And it's not just about paying people. It's about making sure they have consistent, good help for people that are some of our most vulnerable in society. So that would be at the top of my list. Jail-based services. So individuals that have substance use disorders and mental illnesses that had a negative interaction with the law, they're now in jail. How can we make sure that as long as we got them in jail, we take a treatment-based approach? That I would put more resources into the treatment-based approach. And there, I mean, you can use up $30 to $40 million really quickly, but it's a start. And so I'd look forward to the discussion later on. But I appreciate you taking the time and focusing on this and starting this discussion, because it is one of those areas where it's easy for people to just kind of get forgotten because they're living in the shadows of society. But there really are lives that could be successful, productive, independent, self-determined lives that are today are really not, and not only are they not reaching out their full potential, some of them do have negative interactions with the law. Some do find themselves with lifespans 20 years shorter than the rest of us, and employment rates are so low, and it's not because they don't want to work. Just because the world doesn't work for them right now. So I'll leave it there, and I'll look forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Understanding, Lieutenant Governor, is that you would take questions now, that you may not be able to stay. So are there any questions? Yes.
Lieutenant Governor, what can we do as Michigan residents and future lawyers, most of us, to help to see these changes that go through the legislature? So there we go.
Great question. Here's one of the things that, sometimes we have this thing like in the Bible, they ask you for a tithe. You take 10% and it goes toward, and you give it to the church. I like the idea of taking of different professions taking just some kind of whatever you feel like is possible, and essentially doing pro bono work for people that are not getting represented today. This is an area where I think lawyers have a particularly impactful opportunity, because so much of our system, one way or another, there's interaction with the law. So we have this change that Judge Mack and I worked on over the last couple of years, Kevin's Law, and it allows for more earlier intervention for people that have mental illnesses but don't necessarily recognize their need for treatment. So oftentimes what happens is you have a person who's getting worse and worse and worse, and the family sees it happening, but until they get so bad that they're a danger to themselves or others, there's nothing you can really do. And so making the change in Kevin's Law It really does allow for earlier intervention, but a lot of families, there's still got to go to probate court, and you have to meet a standard for ordered treatment, and a lot of families they just can't afford to do it. And so this is it's kind of an enigma, because we have a case where you don't want involuntary treatment to be easy, right? I mean, there needs to be standards to protect civil liberties of people. And so I don't see how you can do it without a court. But the court process is expensive. And so I would hope that not only that there might be some small percentage of time that attorneys might be willing to put toward helping families that can afford it, but even to have lawyers that just specialize in this area. I mean, it's not a highly lucrative area. It's if you go into corporate law and you're drafting contracts and stuff like that, you can make a lot more money. But in family law, it's just an area where there's a huge and growing need. And so I just encourage you to look at whether or not, as you develop your practice of the future, whether or not there's some portion of it that can be dedicated to this kind of work.
Hi, and thanks for speaking, by the way. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm not a law student. Actually, I'm a mental health professional. I run the largest outpatient mental health facility in Clinton County as well as in Gratiot County, and love the opportunity to come and advocate, especially for those who are lower SES, lower socioeconomic status people, such as those on Medicaid, et cetera, et cetera. You spoke about 20 visits, and then people move on to a more serious level of care. I think there's a level of disconnect there.
Yes.
That is not happening.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
We're not able to get people at 20 visits into more care. We're not able to take those people from the carve-outs. We rejoiced when mental health parity got passed and thought, yay, everybody's going to be able to get the care that they need. They were not able to. So we're stuck with people at 20 visits. It's not enough care for people, whether it be substance abuse, mental health. We've done everything from the legal rights office to fighting and advocating through the community mental health, through advocating through the HMOs and the carve-outs. 20 visits is all we're getting for these people, and they're stuck. They're left somewhere, and then we're stuck with, get them into the community mental health. That is not happening. Unless my patient is on fire, and usually even then they still get turned away from the community mental health, they're stuck at 20 visits, and there's nothing else to do. And that's really kind of why I'm here today is I see 10,000 plus people a year, probably 1,000 to 2,000 of which every year get stuck at that 20 visit limit. That's not enough care for them. They get stuck in the system, and then we provide half of a service where then they need to come back next year, and they need to come back next year, and they need to come back next year. Or then we need to try to find somebody who can provide the service for free. And I guess I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that? How can we reconnect that disconnect between this? How can we get those people the care that they need when it's really supposed to already be happening,
right?
And it isn't?
Great question. I'm glad that you mentioned the 20 visits and then where the public mental health or public behavioral health system kicks in, because when it was originally designed, it was contemplated that you have mild mental illnesses, which can just be handled without specialties and that sort of thing in the regular healthcare system. And then there's some line when it becomes serious, and now it's a serious mental illness becomes part of the public health system. So the way that was originally devised leaves an incredibly large gap in between, because statistically what we're finding is that people that exceed their 20 limits and then go to the public mental health system are denied at that level at about 75%. So 75% of the people that reach 20 visits are told by the public mental health system, you're not serious enough to get care from us yet. That's just unacceptable. One of the things that came out of the Mental Health and Wellness Commission, the system really fights this one, but the appeals process for denial of care is handled by the same people that issued the denial. Doesn't make sense, right? I'm not out of line there by saying that doesn't seem like it makes sense. It's not fair. So one of the aspects is there's not a check on when that is. I wish it was more of a bright line. So in other words, you get to a point and your service is over this. Now, it's no longer somebody's judgment. Are you serious enough? Are you not serious enough? Have you contemplated suicide, or are you thinking about hurting somebody? If the answer is no to that, well, you're not serious enough. I don't want it to be somebody's judgment. If we're going to have two different systems, I want it to be a bright line. When you exceed benefits here, now you go here, period. Now, to be fair, the public mental health system is strained in a lot of ways. There are many, many financial constraints on it and the way that it operates. The reason that I think that there's been difficulty, though, in securing additional resources, partly is because this is a group of people that has a hard time advocating for themselves. So it takes an intentional effort. We have to be more than just open for it. We have to actually go out and fight for it. When I first started in this line of advocacy, it didn't seem like there were many people fighting alongside me, aside from people like Mark on the end here, and Milton Mack, really the whole panel. But in the lawmaking process, there weren't very many people that were particularly interested or even knew much about it. And so today, I don't think that's the case. We see more and more people coming to the table. I'm finding more and more support in making both policy changes and resource changes. We're still on the front end of this movement, but part of it is because people are out there living their lives and making their needs and their demands known, and it's having an impact on the system. It's just we're still a couple years into it. We're still only a couple years into this new awareness of how big the need or how big the problem is. So the first step, I think, is that you have to reduce the amount of layers of bureaucracy that the money goes through before it gets to services, before we can make an effective argument for just flat out more money for the services. That's just the way I've seen this system operate. Do really well with what you've been given, and now you can make a case for getting more. There seems to be more willingness when a person is involved with the criminal justice system today for more resources. So I chair the Diversion Council, strategy to divert people away into treatment and away from jail. We have a lot of things that I care about in the budget process between the House and the Senate got wiped out. We're still fighting to get them back in. It's not over yet. They got wiped out. But the Diversion Council pilots that we have going around the state didn't by either the House or the Senate. And so when it comes to law enforcement, mental health coverage, that's the area where people have really kind of bought in earlier. Then with Kevin's Law, we got an appropriation for the assisted outpatient treatment for those who aren't covered by Medicaid or their private insurance. Those are two, relatively small parts of the population, but they're steps in the right direction. So I would say keep on advocating. I think it is starting to make a difference, recognizing we have a long way to go. But ultimately, what I hope to happen is that either we have a system that doesn't have it's your job over here and it's your job over there because somebody's always going to fall out in the middle. Either we put it all together in one, or we have a very bright line where there's an objective standard that says, okay, you exhausted your benefit here, now it gets picked up here, period. There's no judgment call left for it. And so that's what ideally that's where it'll get to. I can't say that we're close. I can only say that we've taken some steps toward it at this point. But thanks for your work.
Being here, I just wanted to ask, knowing what your entry point was into sort of this cause, how did you decide to enlarge it, noting that scientifically autism and mental health and addiction are so different? How did you decide to?
It really was about understanding stigma and how it affected both people's willingness to go and get treatment, their determination to go out there and still live life. And I remember the point when it was like, we were hiding for 2 years. We hid away because we didn't want to have the looks from other people about, because you look at a person with autism and you can't tell that they have autism, but there are times when there are very problematic behaviors. And whenever we'd go out and do something, people would be like, oh, can't you get control of your child? That type of a reaction, and it's just heavy, and you don't want to deal with it, so you stop going places. But the problem is then you stop giving your child access to the world and experience out in the world and be able to see what's happening out there. And so we got to a point where we just decided, we're going to go out and live, and the world's just going to have to deal with it. And it's going to be disruptive sometimes, and it's going to cause problems sometimes, and people are just going to have to deal with it. We're not hiding anymore. And that was right around the time I decided to be much more public about it. And I have to say, it's very freeing. Hiding is it's horrible. It's a horrible way to live, where you think you got to hide who you are and who your family is and all that to try for the convenience of other people or to make other people not feel uncomfortable. But what I found was that people want to understand more than I thought they wanted to understand if I would give them a chance to. And so I just decided to shift to probably half, maybe more, of my public policy development time is spent on these issues. But when I realized that the same type of societal stigma applied to people with mental illnesses and other types of developmental disabilities, I looked at it like we're really all, we're in the same boat. So let's just try and get everybody together on it. And I see the advocacy community, definitely see on this 298 issue, more together than I've ever seen them. And that's that's another reason why I think we've taken some steps now, is because it used to be, everybody was kind of scattered about and they had their issues. Now it's kind of like, all right, here are our common issues, let's fight together for them. And it's made a difference.
Yes, Lieutenant Governor Calley, you talked about layers of bureaucracy, and there's talk about the possibility of block grants. And the Medicaid program itself has waiver options, which are not fully accessed or could be utilized maybe in a greater manner. What's your thought on, of course, it's a double-edged sword. Block grants give the government or give us funding that has some flexibility. The backside of that is a federal government that can restrict the total amount of money they spend and have a set amount. So I could see a number of different political factions working, as well as the insurance industry, the nursing home industry, the healthcare industry, and how all that plays together. But what's your opinion on the block grants and how those might be used with greater versatility to fund some of the things you're talking about? Yeah, pure block grants, in their purest form, I don't think would be a very good idea, because there's just a tendency for government to be bureaucratic. And I don't mean that against anybody in government. I've served for 10 years in state government. But it's just a tendency that builds up over time. What I would rather see, I'd rather see money with less restrictions, but tied to outcomes. So it's a matter of, okay, here's a certain amount of money, and it's expected to serve this many people, and get these types of outcomes for those people. And that's what when I look at all this debate at the federal level and what to do now, and I don't think it's any different than how we need to look at it at the state level. It's not on activities. Right now, everything's activity based. You do these activities, you get reimbursement for these particular activities. I would rather have reimbursement based on outcomes, and have really the incentive be for the resources to really be provided in more effective. And not just, efficiency is, of course, important, but especially in ways that are relevant to what that person needs. When it's activity-based, when everything is just a specific activity-based in a particular lane, what happens is we say to people, hey, regardless of what your needs are, in order to get help from us, you have to conform to the artificial constructions of government. Well, they don't necessarily fit around what the needs of the person are. And so that's where I think we do have an opportunity, and what I hope happens moving forward in the Medicaid system is that it goes away from such a tight prescription-based system to one that is much more outcome-based or outcome-driven.
Is there a final question? Sure.
Lieutenant Governor, thanks for being here. I feel compelled first to tell you, everybody, just to disclose that I'm view this kind of from the lens of a conservative perspective, and as somebody that spent the last 6 years in law enforcement as a police officer. When you talk about making a place for the mentally ill and developmentally disabled, how do you see the government being able to incentivize individuals, businesses, employers to this sort of end without profit prohibitive regulations or excessive tax costs to the individual? I'm just curious about that, if you could.
Yeah, great question. So here's all of our social services. Here's the metric that I would use. And I don't care whether you're liberal or conservative. I mean, I think that people can really rally around this. Are the services that we're providing helping the person to become more independent or not? If they're not helping them to be more independent, and now your reason for wanting the person to be more independent might be several things. You might not want them to be so dependent on government financially. You might want them to just live a more self-determined life. Like, they're in charge of their life. They don't have somebody else making all their decisions. But regardless of why, the idea that we're helping people to become more independent is a good thing. And so that's why when I approach these things, whether it's special education reform, it's all about how do you make sure that kids with disabilities have the same access to curriculum and academics as every other student. Michigan State did a study a few years back that found that a shockingly high number of students this was an autism-specific study, but a shockingly high number of autism students were not expected to reach grade level, that the people charged with their education just didn't expect that to happen. Now, autism is not a cognitive disorder. It's not. I mean, people think that because somebody has a communication deficit that they have a cognitive impairment, but those are two different things. They co-occur sometimes, but those are two different things. And so what happens is you have a system that doesn't necessarily believe in the education outcome for that child. So if we're talking about special education, it's a matter of ensuring that the person has the support that they need in order to achieve independence, to live an independent life. If we're talking about providing behavioral health care services for adults, there are, and by the way, some policy issues that have to be fixed at the federal level in this case. But the idea should be that we're encouraging people to go out there and become more independent. So our employment-based services, I would never want to just say to an employer, you have to hire people with disabilities. But what I do want to say to employers is that there are a lot of people with disabilities that can produce at the exact same level as anybody else, maybe even higher. So take, for example, a person with autism. There are some people with autism that are never going to be able to sell themselves in an interview across the table, but that has nothing to do with what the job is that needs to be done. So you have a company like Walgreens has two facilities for their logistical operations that have 40 to 50% of people in those operations that have autism. And they're the most accurate and efficient warehouse distribution systems that they have. Not in spite of the fact that they have people with autism there, but because of the fact that they have people with autism there. And so that's the thing that we really need to get to to make this shift in, is that when we define a person according to their area of struggle, we're relegating them to a place of dependence for the rest of their lives, instead of doing the thing that the rest of us were afforded, the courtesy that the rest of us have been afforded, which is to be defined according to our strengths, to build our lives around our strengths, to use our strengths to mitigate our weaknesses. And so if we can help people with disabilities to go out there, just like Jim Abbott. Jim Abbott from Flint, born without a right hand, yet he pitched 10 years in the major leagues. Now, including on the Yankees, where he pitched a no-hitter. There's no charity on the Yankees. He had to learn, in spite of his disability, to do the job just as well or better as anybody else. And people with disabilities, just to do the regular things that you and I take for granted, they got to be innovative and creative. They have to be determined. They have to persevere. They have to prepare more. I mean, so what happens is we say on the front end, oh, this person has a disability, they can't do the job. But the amazing thing about Jim Abbott is that, I've heard his story. The most remarkable thing is that there's nothing remarkable about it, except for that all the adults in his life growing up encouraged him to go out there and do amazing things. They never said, hey, somebody like you shouldn't be dreaming about being a baseball player. It's not very realistic. Instead, they say, how can we help you to achieve that? There's pretty amazing things that can happen. I know of one employer right here in Michigan that was hiring for a high-low driver, and a person who was deaf applied. And they said, well, you can't really do the the job because you're deaf?" And the person said, "Why not? I can still do the job." So, no, one of the things you have to do, for example, the safety inspection in the morning, you have to test the horn. And how would you know if the horn worked? And he said, "Well, let me show you." So they went out to the warehouse. He got on the high-low. He drove up behind some people that were just sitting there talking. He honked the horn. Yes, the horn works. So the thing is, when we say ahead of time, a person with disability, so you can't, a lot of times, not a lot of times, all the time, we're selling the person short, that they can do amazing things. And so I don't think it's a matter of mandates as much as education. You provide education on the front end, and then you educate employers about all these preconceived notions that you have. You're missing out on this really talented workforce that is more. I was at one employer that has been very, very successful right here in Lansing in hiring people with disabilities, particularly developmental disabilities, which have the worst discrimination against them usually. And I met with one man who works on the factory floor, and he had been there for 20 years, and he could do every single job on the entire floor. Now, and go to any other factory and say, how would you like to have somebody that is versatile, can do any job on the floor, has the same productivity as anybody else, and would stick with you for 20 years? And it's a person that has an intellectual disability and IQ around 60. Or and then the next person that I talked to, the same thing, except for she had been there for 12 years. So you have loyalty and longevity, and that, and also perseverance in the same productivity level. So I think there's this like discrimination out there, which is it's not, people aren't trying to be bad or anything. It's just that the way that our world has always looked at people with disabilities is wrong, and we just need to help make it right, and then and give them a chance, and they'll do really well. So it's not mandates as much as take advantage of all the opportunities that are out there, both for the individual and for our economy and society, that would be better if we're more inclusive minded. Thank you guys for the invitation.
Thank you.
We have a law review member that's going to introduce a panelist.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Langton. I'm the sub-site editor on the Law Review. I'm here to introduce Major Sam Davis, our next panelist. Major Davis was a teacher, coach, and administrator with the Lansing Public Schools from 1974 to 2007. Before working as a correction major with the Ingham County Sheriff's Office. He's a Michigan State University graduate, and he's been the president of the Lansing Wrestling Officials Association since 1992. And he's also a lead teaching official at Michigan High School Athletic Association clinics. So please welcome Major Sam Davis.
Thank you, everyone. This is not my topic, not my forte. I'm going to talk about things from experiential base, what I do every day as a jail administrator for the Ingham County Sheriff's Office. And so I'm going to share some statistics with you that have more to do with Ingham County Jail, my own personal experiences, some anecdotal things that have happened. I'll cite some statistics, but they are very particular to that which I know. I don't know all the legislation. I'm not following any laws and all that kind of stuff. You won't get that from me. What you'll get is some practical everyday stuff. But one of the things I want to do before I get deep into this, I want everybody to stand up. If you have a cell phone or whatever, take it out. Take a look at it. Check your cell phone, see if there are any messages that you've missed. Anybody has sent you anything? Because I want you to do that. Stretch, talk to somebody for a second if you want. I want you to feel free to do whatever you want to do for about a minute. Do what you want to do. Do what you want to do. You need to get some water or whatever. Just a good stretch. You can sit down if you want to sit down. You can turn around. Want to sing a little ditty? You can do that. All right, you can sit down if you want to. I want you to remember what you did. I want you to remember what you did. We're going to come back to that, and there's a reason I had you do what you just did. Let me share some things with you. As an educator, and I spent 33 years in the Lansing School District, and to one of my colleagues, Sharon Plavnik back there. Hello, Sharon. Thank you for welcoming me and reminding me of the good days in education. But I saw a lot of things as a teacher and as a principal and central administrator that I didn't know that I would, at some point, years later, see again, and see it in a different light, in a different way. I had students in school who had disabilities, learning disabilities, mental health disabilities. As an educator and as a teacher, I was kind of led to believe, whether it's because I wanted to believe it or just because I was so naive, that the best way to deal with anyone's mental illnesses was to medicate them. And medicate, and medicate, and medicate. Because, they had to fit in with the rest of us. We didn't have to adjust to them. They had to adjust to the way we were doing things, and that meant medicate, medicate, medicate. And if the medication didn't work, if their behavior was so bizarre, it was so upsetting, so out of the norm, what did we do with them? We moved them to a special classroom, to a special setting, and we labeled it so that everybody knew who they were, where they belonged, and then we learned how to get along with people who had a disability. Ignorance on my part? Was I just like the rest of it? I don't know. At that point, I didn't know. I mean, I know a lot more today than I did, but I really thought, get the kid on their bed, Ritalin. Got to have it. Make sure they have lots of it. All right? When you look at the jails, I now see on the other end some of the effects of those people who use lots and lots of medication and who were ostracized or placed in a certain place or labeled in a certain way. And I know how we dealt with them in a classroom, in a school setting. And I look at how we deal with them now in a jail setting. One of the things I felt that education had was the resources to help them. I thought the money was there. And so we would have an IEP if we needed to have an IEP. And we said, make sure that these funds are available and make sure A, B, C, and D, because this is a special category of student who needs to be taken care of. We were good with the lip service. I don't know how effective we were in actually transitioning them from how they were to how we wanted them to be. But I do know that we were very effective at kind of containing and managing. Well, let me tell you what we do in the jails because we don't have the resources. We contain. We try and manage. One expects that if you are running a jail, if you're a law enforcement officer, I've been 10 years with the sheriff's office, a little over 10 years, and I'm not only a corrections officer, but I'm also a certified police officer. And at the wonderful young age of 58, I went through the police academy and ended up coming out as a licensed MCO police officer. So from teacher and coach and central administrator to corrections officer and police officer, I see every day a lot of folks that I saw back in the schools. In schools, one of the ways I said we'd handled it was making sure they were medicated. And the other was to put them in some place where they were sequestered from everyone else, or lobby to have them go to a special school, get them out of where we were. It doesn't happen in law enforcement and corrections. Because what we were looking for, what we believed we had some time ago, were all these state institutions where folks who had special needs could go. They barely exist anymore. Unfortunately, if you are in jail, you usually have committed a crime. And there's a sanction that goes with committing a crime. And so the judges want you to spend X amount of time in jail. It's unfortunate if you are also dealing with some sort of mental illness, substance abuse, co-occurring disorder. because you have to serve your time when in fact you need to be in an institution where the underlying cause of that crime can be addressed, which is the mental illness or the substance abuse. But you have this time that you need to serve. And I also need to know if you are going to go someplace, and that someplace being a residential treatment place, will they accept you? Well, let me share with you, I have tried to place a number of folks in a residential setting who truly, from my perspective as a jail administrator, needed help. And many folks have been turned away. Now, let me tell you why. They are too violent. They desperately need help, but they are violent. And an underlying core of that core of their behavior is this disability. If you don't treat the disability, they're going to continue to spiral. But trying to get them into an institution for services, often told, they're too violent. Well, what do I do with a person who is too violent and who needs mental health services? Keep them locked up. Do you think I have the resources at the Ingham County Jail with just under 600 inmates to treat those folks who have mental health issues? You think I have the resources? How many of you think I have the resources? Good. I'm glad those hands didn't go up because I don't have the resources. I have 1.5 mental health therapists in the Ingham County Jail for a population of just under 600 inmates. Now, I'm not a mathematician, not a math whiz, but if you give me 1.5 to 600, I don't think that's a winning percentage for the 1.5. There's no way that they can handle that. No way they can handle that. And mental health conditions like major depression, schizophrenia, and substance use disorders are significantly more common in jails than in general society for our population. For our population. Let me share with you, in the past few years, there's been a noticeable increase in inmates with substance abuse and mental health issues. And the combination of those two are referred to, and certainly the experts here know this much better than I do, as co-occurring disorders. Those co-occurring disorders. I'll tell you that the best funding source for the disorders that we deal with in the jail, do you think I have a better funding source for mental health or for substance abuse? Substance abuse. Substance abuse. Do you think that we have a large number of co-occurring disorders within the jail? We have a very large number of co-occurring disorders. But here's the problem. If their primary disorder is not a substance abuse, where the funding is, then they are second in that group, or second in line to receive services. So you can't have a primary severe mental health issue with an underlying substance abuse issue and be first in service in our jail. So we have a lot of folks who stand on the side waiting to be serviced. In 2016 in the Ingham County Jail, we saw a 15% increase in the enrollment of our jail mental health services unit. A 15% increase. Over 180 men and women out of a population at that time of about 500 entered the base level mental health program at the ICJ. How do we determine when you walk into that jail whether or not you have a disability? We have a questionnaire. And we ask you, have you? And part of this is based on acts of violence towards yourself or towards others. Have you recently attempted suicide or attempted suicide in the last 5 years? Have you had suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideations? Lieutenant Governor was talking about within this room, he's sure that there's some in here who have or are dealing with some sort of a condition that you're treating and you're functioning relatively well. But if I ask you right now in front of your peers, who in here has a mental health disorder that's being treated? And how many, and what are you taking for, and how many of you have suicidal thoughts or have attempted suicide in the past? Even if you have, the majority of us are what? Going to do what? We're not going to say anything. We are not going to disclose that. Why? Lieutenant Governor already talked about it. The stigma that's attached to it. And so you're not going to. My deputies, how many of my deputies, of the 80 that I'm responsible for, how many of them do you think are mentally health trained and can identify a disorder? None. None. Their training comes from what? Day-to-day experience. They see something, they see it again, they think they know something, and now we diagnose something. And that's about it. If you have a mental health need, are you going to go to, and they don't even do this anymore, I was going to say, you're going to go to the gas station and ask the guy that pumps the gas to help you with your mental, no. Well, you have corrections officers who know very little about mental health, but we are tasked with determining, at least as an entry level, whether or not there's a mental health need. When folks come to the jail who have mental health problems and have been dealing with it in the community, what don't they bring with them to the jail? That direct support that they had? Did you know that if you come to the jail and you're on prescribed, gotta be on prescribed, if you're on prescribed narcotics, you think you're allowed to bring those into my jail? No? But you need them. But you're not allowed to bring them in. Why can't you bring them to my jail?
Can't have access to them?
So others can't have access to them. Because people use those things to barter, to pet. Hopefully none of you have had this experience. You come in, jail does not make you mentally ill. It doesn't do that. But you know what it contributes to? Depression, feelings of isolation, the stigma that's attached. Is that a good place for you to be getting the services that you need? It's not a good place for you to be getting the services. So tell me, why do we have so many people in jail who need to be in institutions? And I don't mean institutions in terms of what they used to have in Traverse City with that, the dark, cold, gray wall and shackles, but in some sort of residential treatment place. Why don't we have more people, or the majority of the people who are in jail who need that, in these institutions? Well, because so many of them are private institutions, and they can say, you can come because you don't get sad. You're not very you're not self-destructive or anything like that. So you can come. You can't come. Okay? You attack people, you run away, you're screaming all the time, you're not the person we want to have in here. And I can make that determination. But guess who needs to be in my institution more? Yeah, you more than you. You're going to be a success story for me as well. So it's going to help me with my funding because you are going to be a success story. You would screw it all up, so you don't get to come. All right? I have a place for you. It's the 630 North Cedar Street in Mason. It's the Ingham County Jail because that's the better place for you. Okay? In 2015, approximately 1,200 of the 8,500 inmates that came to the Ingham County Jail were screened for mental health services. 1,200 out of 8,500 were screened for that. Well, how did we screen? I already told you, didn't I? Okay? What's another thing that was used to screen? Not just the deputies. What else? Who brought you to me? Law enforcement officer. What are they telling me? And this is not going to be politically correct. The dude's crazy. Okay? They were talking to themselves in the back of the police car when they were coming up. They were screaming, they were yelling. I don't know how many of you, unfortunately only because of my profession, I don't know how many of you have ever been in the back of a police car. Not a pleasant place to be. I don't know how many of you ever had handcuffs on you, except through the police academy. I haven't, but not a very pleasant feeling. How many of you ever been placed in a holding tank? I don't want to know your hand. See your hand. Because some of you have a little drink every now and then. But how many of you ever been placed in a holding cell? Think about it. This is a nice big room. Even if you have claustrophobia, it's a nice big room. You can breathe, you got light, you can see, you can get up and move around a little bit. But think about being confined in a 8 by 14 cell. In whose clothing? Mine. My jumpsuit. You're wearing my Crocs. Okay? Yeah, Crocs. That's what you're getting. All right? I tell you when to get up. I tell you when to go to sleep. I tell you when to eat. I provide you with an excellent menu, whatever I give you. Okay? That's your menu. Those are your choices. And by the way, you need your medication. You're locked up. My clothes, my time, my food, my hours, my orders. You need your medication, and I'm not giving it to you. Do you think it contributes a little bit to my problem? Just a little bit. And yet I'm not doing anything to help you. I'm the jail administrator for almost 600 people, and I'm not doing anything to help you. So I go to my community mental health people, and I say, I need more help. I need more support. I go to my medical folks, and I say, I need more help. I need more support. And I tell my sheriff, I need to run a safe jail and secure jail. Now, safe and secure jail keeps narcotics out. Okay? I tell my mental health people, I need more help. They give me 1.5 therapists for 600 people. I tell the community, I need you to help this person who is truly, truly in need, and they say they're too violent. So what are we doing to help address the needs of those who have mental health issues and co-occurring disorders in the jail? I'm providing you with a place to sleep. I'm providing you with some food. And I don't know, and I can't argue against the Lieutenant Governor, because I don't know about the legislation. But I tell you what, there's not enough money coming into the jail to deal with the folks who have mental illnesses and co-occurring disorders. Let me share a couple more statistics with you. And again, I can only talk to you from what I know, what I see, what I experience. It won't be super educated in terms of this law, this is what's happening in the world of mental health. These experts will do that. I can't do that. But I can tell you that of the 460 inmates who were serviced, there were 460 inmates that were serviced for mental health illnesses in the last year. That's an increase of 28%. So we had the screening of 1,200 out of 8,500, and we had the service for 460, increase of 28%. But what service did I give them? I can give you group therapy. Occasionally I can give you some one-on-one. And occasionally I can give you some prescribed medications. Not all of them. I can give you some. Of the 460, roughly 200 of those inmates who were seen had co-occurring diagnoses. And what are we better at dealing with in the jail in the co-occurring disorder? The substance abuse or the mental health? So we take care of you. If you're a meth head, okay, if you're doing a lot of hydrocodone, oxycodone, okay, we can cut that out. And you know what? You're much better on that spectrum. But what about the rest of it? As the governor was saying, from the head up and the head down. What about the rest of the body? So with the drugs, I'm taking care of the rest of the body. What about here? What's going on there? How are we taking care of that? And of course, you know that with the opioid epidemic, and we get you off of opioids and you have a co-occurring disorder, what are we finding that's happening once we get people and keep them in jail for 90 days or 180 days and they stay off of opioids and then they're released? They use again. But what happens? Out of death. Because the system is not able to handle it. Because when you were taking it right along, your system was what? Kind of adjusting to it. It kind of had you kind of like maintenance. But when you're off it for a while and you get this new infusion, it's like your body has never had it before. You know, like you get pumped with a whole bunch of adrenaline, it can kill you. But we work off of adrenaline. But you get too much of it at one point in time, it can kill you. But the thinking isn't right. We've taken care of the substance abuse, but the thinking still is not right. Now, the increase in numbers continues to show the growing need for co-occurring mental health services in the jail. Inmates, as said before, do not come to jail and get mentally ill or develop a substance abuse problem. They bring it with them. But like I said, what don't they bring with them? They don't bring that support. They don't bring that care. They don't bring their medications. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services 2014 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, approximately 7.9 million adults had a co-occurring disorder. 7.9 million. And in 2015, those adults surveyed who experienced a substance use disorders and any mental health illness, their rates were highest among those between the ages of 26 and 49, for about 43% of them. And for adults with serious mental illness and co-occurring substance disorders, the rate was highest among those 18 to 25, for about 35%. What age range do you think we have mostly in jail? 18 to 50, 18 to 60. I just spouted off some statistics for substance abuse primary, mental health primary, and I just told you that there were 1,200 folks who came into the jail last year who were screened for those problems. That's an awful lot of folks in the jail who have those problems, but I only have 1.5 people to address those. How can the jails be considered the place for people? Let me tell you this. Society, not necessarily you folks, but society is happy that there's a place for those with mental disorders to go. Tell me I'm not telling the truth. Society is happy that there's a place. Part of it is misunderstanding. Remember me way back when as the teacher? Didn't really understand. Thought more drugs, sequester, separate. I guarantee you that I see behaviors in the jail from folks who, if they're like you or sitting out here, that I would never see when you're sitting out here. I don't see them. But in jail, I see some very, very bizarre things. Very bizarre. I'm not going to recount them to you because you've seen enough television shows, so you know what those things are. But they're happening every day in jail, and there is nothing, substantially nothing that we're able to do. The increase in inmates in Ingham County Jail with co-occurring disorders it's really congruent with the trends of across Michigan and the United States. Let me share a few statistics with you. According to recent Department of Justice estimates, approximately 700,000 adults with mental illnesses enter U.S. jails every year, and approximately 75% of those, now these are Department of Justice statistics, not mine, 75% of those individuals suffer from co-occurring disorders, particularly substance abuse. Not my statistics. In Michigan, the odds of a person with a serious mental health illness being in jail or prison compared to a hospital is 4.5 to 1. 4.5 to 1. You're likely to be in jail rather than in a hospital. Lieutenant Governor talked about it. Is there the money to take care of those who need to be in a hospital versus in jail? I don't have money. There are currently a disproportionately high number of people with mental illness, co-occurring mental health, substance abuse disorders, and homelessness in jail. And listen to this one. 10 times more mentally ill people are now in jails and prisons than in any state psychiatric hospital. 10 times more. And what kind of treatment are they getting? Not a whole lot. I can't do a whole lot. I can keep them confined, have them do their time. And those that really act out, I can get them and try to have them PRT'd. And maybe have them PRT'd. I can get a PRT, but then I have a problem getting a cert. Because in some cases, I need 2 doctors to tell me that the person needs treatment. And I can get them PRT'd and send them over, and I have a working relationship, very good, with community mental health, and send them over to community mental health, and community mental health can try to find a bed. And I'm waiting for the cert, but I need 2 doctors, but guess what? I only have, 1 doctor on staff. So I can't get the cert. Now, I have 10 days once I get the PRT. But if I get a cert and then I can't find a bed placement, I only have, 72 hours with my cert. And if I don't find a bed, then what do I have to do? PRT again, or I have 10 days. Oh, but by the way, and again, great working relationship with CMH, they don't have holding areas for people. They have conference rooms or they have a lounge. So they don't want to leave those people there who may be dangerous, who may want to walk away, run away. So if they can't find a bed for them and they're out at CMH, what happens to them? Back to jail. Where I'm doing what with them? Housing them, monitoring them. And then we start the cycle all over again. So when we talk about what's going on in the jails, when we talk about what's happening with mental health, jails are not equipped to provide effective treatment for mentally ill and substance abusing inmates. We need support to provide adequate and sustained help. We need support. And families, I tell you, they're crying and pleading every day. Every day. Parents are saying, brothers are saying, grandparents are saying, how can Sam get help? We need him to get help. We need him to get help. And unfortunately for me, some of those folks who are not getting help do what in the jail? They kill themselves. They kill themselves. We have an issue. I don't have the solution. I love when I hear, and again, no disrespect to anyone, I love when I hear the politicians saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, here's the money, da-da-da. But if the system is so tied up and so bureaucratic that we can't get what we need, the mental health issue continues to rise. The support services continue to go this way, and it's moving towards epidemic. Don't know what we can do, but I'm glad we got some lawyers who are going to help us out in the future.
Thank you. So my name is Megan Leva. I'm the articles editor for WMU Cooley Law School. The next panelist we have is Beverly Griffor. She's a lawyer, professor, and a mental health professional whose work currently focuses on the application of scientific research in the courtroom and use of expert witnesses. She's the managing partner of Collis and Griffor, PC. She graduated from the University of Michigan and also attended Ave Maria Law School in Ann Arbor. In addition, Beverly subconcentrated in both criminology and social inequality, and she also teaches undergraduate and graduate level courses at Concordia University in Ann Arbor. And she's currently working on a study of child testimony and is pursuing her PhD in clinical psychology with a focus on neuropsychology and forensics. So please welcome Beverly Griffor.
All right, I have to make the technology work now. All right, I'm smart enough to do that today. Thank you so much for the introduction. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here and have a chance to speak with you about something that is very close to my heart. I have been working in this area, particularly mental health and social justice in the criminal justice system for about a decade at this point. I'm particularly interested in making sure that all people have access to justice in whatever form it is and whatever location they may be. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. American journalist and satirist H.L. Mencken, who extensively covered the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, the Scopes monkey trial, is attributed with the following quote: "Equality before the law is probably forever unattainable. It is a noble ideal, but it can never be realized, for what men value in this world is not rights, but privileges." While he made this statement in relation to the educational system at the time, it is equally applicable to mental health care now. A pattern of privilege means that it's often difficult or effectively cost prohibitive to have mental health professionals involved in litigation in the criminal justice system or anywhere where these rights might touch our courts. So often what that means is the choice to forego those experts and forego their services for our clients is selected. Unfortunately, that means that mental health care often is still considered the privilege of the elite. And in fact, it's really a problem because the very group of people that are most likely in the courts to need mental health professionals involved are also the ones that are not going to get access to them. So in practice, we lose representation for the largest portions of our population. So social justice demands that attorneys and professionals become familiar with how we can use our supporting resources to serve our clients' needs. And sometimes this involves hiring experts, and sometimes this means involving consultants so that we can better understand how we can bring that impact to our cases for a lower cost. But they only gave me 15 minutes. I hear we're playing with that a little fast and loose today, so I'm not going to get a little worried about it. But there's a great deal of information to cover. That's all I have for time. So while there are a lot of aspects of expert work that could be involved, I can't go over everything. So I'm not going to bother you with how to find your experts or how to prep up your cases or what to do in situations when you have active mental health worker involved in the case already. What I'm particularly going to be talking about is how to handle the preparation, the actual engagement. How do you know that you need to have an expert? What do you need to do? And what thought process should you really go through as you embark on this decision? Because choosing not to have an expert oftentimes puts these clients in jail. You are the last stop between your client and the jail system. What you do will often have an impact about whether this person has treatment at all, whether they have effective care, whether they're even diagnosed. The way that the jails and the criminal justice system know that someone even needs care to let the 1.5 therapist get involved with them is if we flag it somewhere. A good way to do that is to get a mental health professional involved, get people involved in the early stages so that the person's needs begin to get met and hopefully treatment plans can be continued. So we're going to talk about identifying an area in need of expert focus in your particular case, constructing an accurate referral question for your professional, and knowing your professional's ethical boundaries. So the first thing we need to know is, how is mental health raised in this particular case? So do you have a family law client who is suffering from PTSD and it's impacting their parenting skills? Are you handling a civil case and somebody was terminated, but there's a question as to whether their termination was because of a factor of a disability that's protected under the ADA? Is your client in a criminal case cognitively impaired, so they don't understand the nature of their action? Are they dealing with a comorbid substance abuse disorder that impacted their behavior or their history? Do you have somebody that you're trying to understand whether or not they should be going through inpatient treatment or outpatient treatment? Or is someone on court order and they're trying to evaluate whether or not that should continue? That's how you identify this. Lawyers are pretty good at this. What's the issue? We're issue spotters. That's how we're trained. Unfortunately, we also need to figure out in all these areas whether our client is actually entitled to an expert. And sometimes that doesn't mean entitled by law. Sometimes that means in your county, do they do that? So your county-specific rules are going to be able to tell you whether or not in your situation a judge is likely to appoint an expert in a time of need, or whether there are even going to be funds available, especially towards the ends of the budget year. In some areas, there's case law on point in your particular field. So in the criminal arena, for example, Aki versus Oklahoma tells us that if there is a mental health issue implicated, your defendant is entitled to an expert. Well, we thought that was pretty clear, but apparently not so much. In practice, the expert that they're entitled to is often the prosecutor's expert because they get to talk to them. And in fact, right now, the primary holding in that case is being addressed. So the primary holding is, we hold that when the defendant makes this preliminary showing that mental health is going to be at issue, the state must assure the defendant access to a competent psychiatrist who will assist in evaluation, preparation, and presentation of their defense. McWilliams versus Dunn before the Supreme Court right now, argued April 24th out of the 11th Circuit, is addressing this very question. What does it mean in a criminal case that an expert is presenting the defense with support? I don't know the answer to that question. Hopefully sometime in June, the Supreme Court will come back and let us know whether that means we have to settle for the guy that doesn't see the problem, or if we have the opportunity as a right to get funding for some alternative. Now, in family law cases, we have to look at the same questions, but there aren't any rights to experts in family law cases. So if we have children that have special needs or disabilities, or parents that have special needs or disabilities, we are the ones, as attorneys, who are going to be required to show the court that our parent is capable or that these needs are being met. In some cases, that means that we're going to friend of the court. In some cases, that means we're getting independent evaluations or even neuropsychological evaluations of particular parents. And without those, these parents can kiss their rights goodbye, but they're not paid for by the state. In addition, in civil cases, you have a whole set of other requirements. One of the most pertinent is that a lot of those cases have therapists involved already. Someone has gotten involved before the filing of the suit. And you, as the attorney of the case now, have to make the decision whether we're going to get in touch with that person or start all over. This is a case-by-case decision that has to be made. Sometimes we have records to review. Sometimes we don't. We make the best decision that we can. But funding is an issue here, too. Because if you try to get a new therapist that will be a little bit more financially friendly for your client, you're going to be accused of trying to stack the deck. Now, in probate cases, we have other issues. Issues in probate cases involve competency and capacity. So in those cases, sometimes we don't even know who the professionals are. So in a probate case, when you're dealing with the administration of, say, a decedent's estate, you don't even know who the decedent's physician was half the time. So now you have to reconstruct the intentions and the understanding of that decedent with the help of a professional, and you have no access to anything. This is not something that most lawyers are very familiar with or have done more than a few times. And if they have, they run screaming as though their house is on fire. The other aspect of this is getting involved in independent medical or psychological investigations for things like guardianships. If you have a guardianship or a conservatorship and you need to be able to make a showing of competency or capacity, there's no funding available for that either. So where that puts us is, what are we going to do about this funding problem? So unfortunately, it comes down to doing our homework. Some counties have specific funds earmarked for some situation that you might find yourself in, although not all. So I check your county, find out whether your particular box is on their little form of money, and then you're good to go for a little while. Unfortunately, each county actually handles these appointments differently. So if they don't have a fund or there is no general fund available for this, then you're looking at sort of standardized payment options. So in Washtenaw County, where I practice, when you are trying to get an independent medical evaluation, say for the purpose of competency, or because somebody is going through involuntary commitment proceedings, Washtenaw County will pay the professional who does that $250. And they wonder why people aren't banging down the door to get involved in this process. Most of these professionals charge more than that at an hourly rate. And guess what? These take about 10 hours to do a pop. They're not fun. They take a long time. It's a lot of paperwork. And we're giving people $250. Now, some counties do operate on an hourly basis. I recently worked on a case in Monroe where our appointed psychologist was paid $55 an hour for a maximum of 12 hours. Kind of arbitrary, but that's the way it works. And then I've also worked in other counties and done consulting in other counties where the hourly payments are between $75 and $150 an hour. So what we're saying is, in cases where people need the help and they run into the criminal justice system, or you're threatening to take away their children, or you're saying that they're incompetent and can't manage their own affairs, and they don't have the funds to fight you, who's going to help them? So what other resources does your client have? Do they have any special memberships? Do they have anything at all that you can draw on? Do they have access to Veterans Affairs services? Are they VA veterans? Do they have AARP services? AARP actually has some pretty interesting discounts for their members as far as member services. Do they actually qualify for Medicaid or Medicare? Because of course you can get evaluations through both of those programs, although waiting lists can be challenging, but judges usually understand. Do they have any other membership that they pay for? So do they have a disability or an insurance policy that could be drawn on for these funds? If they don't have those, we look at whether there are nonprofits that are available that can support them. And in many cases, this does exist, particularly with those with disability or those who we believe have, we want to screen, say for intellectual disability or developmental challenges. Now, the other issue we look at is whether there are already existing reports. Do you already have therapy notes? Did this person come to you having already been in 2 years of therapy with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia before they came to you? First, you probably don't know what that means. Read the reports. Figure it out. You need an expert. Do you have school records? Do you have occupational therapy records? Do you have anything from the developmental history of this individual, particularly when you're dealing with young adults? This information might still be accessible. High schools may have it, grade schools may have it. Do you have IEPs that you can look at? Anything that you can look at helps you here. Because if you have the records, your first step might not be an expert. Your first step might be a consultant, somebody that can sit down with you and say, okay, let's figure out what direction you need to go to address this particular individual's needs. And the good news here is that consultant signs their retainer agreement with you. That means all of the communications between you and the consultant are work products. You don't have to turn over any of that at any time. Now, that consultant isn't testifying. So when you choose to use a consultant, you have to be fairly certain that you either can afford or absolutely cannot afford to have an independent expert work for you. So once you've gone through that whole process and you know that you have a client that has some sort of mental health challenge that they're facing and they've gotten themselves somehow involved in the criminal justice system, you've figured out what the issue is, essentially, and you've identified sort of the funding source. You now know how much or how little you have to work with. What that means is we have to get good at constructing a referral question. We have to be able to articulate what it is that we want to have assessed. I am both an attorney and a mental health professional, and the number of times I have to call an attorney and say, this is not a thing, is amazing. We, as mental health professionals, need to know what you are asking of us. And so this is what I ask people to go through, and I want you to be able to understand that. First, what is the ultimate question? What is the outcome that you are seeking? What do you want to have happen? Does the ultimate question here involve state of mind? Are you trying to show capacity or lack thereof? Are you trying to prove parental fitness? The first thing you need to know is really what that end goal is. And again, attorneys, we're issue spotters. This you should be able to do, and it's the way you start. Next is sort of that underlying question. Okay, well, what do you really need to know? So what are you missing? What would you have to show in addition to the information you have in order to answer the question? So what piece is missing? Do you need to know what somebody was thinking at the time of a crime? And if you knew that, you would have the answer. Do you need to know how somebody's decision-making process works to know whether it's sound? Do you have to be able to prove that granddad knows what property he owns? Do you need to know how to identify if someone is operating under a delusion? Do you need to know that somebody can understand what their child's interests are? These are all questions that aren't really the ultimate goal, but they're that piece that's missing for us. Very rarely are you going to be dealing with a professional where the ultimate goal and that piece are exactly the same. Next, you need to know who do you need to prove it to? And in addition to that, what context are you in? So judges and juries take in information differently. And the context here is important as well. Motion hearings versus bench trials versus jury trials. The setting is key because you can attach things to motions that you can't attach to juries. You can present things in different ways to each of these bodies. And what that means is what you're looking for and how you're going to present that is going to be different. And your presentation to the fact finder may impact what decisions you make about your expert. So your audience and your context matter here. Then you want to know who can help you do that. You know what to prove, you know who it needs to be proven to, but who is going to be the best person to explain that? If it's the neighbor, then you don't need an expert. If it's the neighbor who says, oh, I saw him outside right before he got into that fight, chasing a demon through the sky, yelling at it. Okay, probably at this point, you can explain that to a judge. Probably at this point, you have enough to sustain sort of maybe the burden for a motion, right? You don't need an expert to meet that kind of a threshold in that situation. But in a jury trial, jury doesn't really get anything else. They're not going to be able to take that presentation and draw conclusions from it. And that's what your expert would be for. So you need to identify who can help your fact finder draw conclusions if they're necessary, and then figure out how what they would say could impact your case. And that's the basis for the beginning of that construction. Then here's the punchline. What specific question do you want your expert to answer? What specific question? So you can't just give the entire file to the expert and say, go. That's kind of like driving your car into the dealership and being like, I need a service appointment, something's wrong, and then running away. All right. They're going to ask you questions. When was it last working? Do you have the service history? Do you have any other paperwork? Have you ever had a problem before? And where is the noise coming from? Right? That's what you're doing with this question. Because a mental health professional approaches a case differently depending on what the question is. So if you are asking, does this particular defendant understand right now what's going on? That's all that the mental health professional needs to evaluate. They're not going to read all of the history of the case. Right? They're going to need to know some psychiatric history. They're going to have background information. But you save time by giving an accurate referral question. And time is money. And money is what prohibits many, many people from getting access to services. So if you can squash the timeline so that your indigent client is not paying $75 an hour for your expert and you, now they're going to have access to some care. Next, you need to know your professional's ethical boundaries, and I cannot overstate this more. Know the boundaries. Once you have the resources that your client has and you've put your referral question together, you're at a point now where you're deciding what kind of professional you need to deal with your client's needs. Are we dealing with multiple sclerosis? We need the doctor, a neurologist. Do we need a clinical psychologist to talk about things like cognitive decline in major depressive disorder? Do you need a forensic psychologist in order to demonstrate a review of a pattern of history over an extended period of time? Do you need the person's personal therapist to describe their experience of an event? Do you need a psychiatrist to talk about medications and how they might be influencing your particular client or your client's situation? Right? Once you've figured that out, take a look. Take a look. Take a look. All of these individuals have governing bodies. Those governing bodies have rules about what those professionals can and cannot do, much like the rules that bind attorneys. So you have the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, and those are just the ones that start with A. All right. All of these professionals have those. Before you call your professional, pull up the professional rules for the field that you are looking to engage and make sure what you want to ask them is proper. For example, it is not ethical for a psychologist to diagnose your client's ex-wife with bipolar. You can't do that. You can't ask your expert to do that because they're only permitted to diagnose people who they have done in-person evaluations with. So you cannot demonstrate that your client's ex-wife is bipolar and therefore should not have the children or any of your money by giving a stack of papers to an expert. That's unethical for them. It's not unethical for you. You can give them and ask whatever you want, but it's going to cost the money to write the report that says, I'm sorry, we can't do this, and here's why. Because they're going to write you a 3-page CYA letter, just like you do when people ask you the same question, and they're going to bill for it, and then you got to start all over again. And now your client's running out of money. Right? So don't ask that question. A psychiatrist can't testify as to how a particular drug gave side effects to your particular client at any particular time. What they can say, if they have enough information, is how this individual generally reacts to this medication. And if they haven't met your client, they can't even say that. They can say that Ritalin has side effects that cause insomnia in some people. No idea if that in fact impacts your guy. So don't ask a question that they're not going to be able to answer. And if you do, they're just going to tell you, I can't do that, and you're going to have to start over. But if you then have that person testify for you, they now get to field that question. What were you asked to do? Well, the first time I was asked to do this thing that I can't do. And then the second time I was asked to do this thing that I can't do. And then the third time, this is what I asked, and I did that. Well, now through no fault of the paperwork and no fault of the professional, they're not looking like they're really impartial. So we have to be careful about that. The other issue is that we don't put our expert in jeopardy. We're professionals. We work together. It's the only way that any of this makes any sense. All right, we have people in a very vulnerable group that need support. And the only way that we can do this is if we all work together. And in order to do that, we cannot put each other on the hot seat. We just can't do it. So if we give that information out there, we could serve to discredit our expert. And in some cases, we could even disqualify our expert. Maybe we gave them something right away that they shouldn't have according to their professional ethics. Maybe they used to work for somebody that's related on the other side, and we didn't look into that. And it's a conflict for them because they're still in touch or have access to information. Now, not only are we putting our expert, our professional, in the hot seat, but we're jeopardizing our own case. So we want to be careful when we're interacting, particularly in the initial engagement with an expert, that we're doing the best we can to make sure we're following their ethical boundaries. So, this is the we're almost done slide. Yeah. So we want to identify the area. We need expert focus, know our client's rights, identify the funding source, know our limits, know when our client has to cut and run, do everything that you can within that bound. Construct an accurate referral question, identifying the issue, what do you need to prove and to who, and what specific question needs to be answered. And then select your field based on the information you have, review those ethics, and make sure your requests are appropriate. Now, I can't tell you everything there is to tell you, and I did the best I could, but even I had to cut some stuff out, and I'm still over time. I sucked my extra time out, just like all my colleagues. Maybe the guys later will do a little bit better, who knows. But if this doesn't answer questions or you need a little bit more, find an expert and take them to lunch. We eat, we talk, we love our jobs. We want to tell you all about them. We want to tell you what ridiculous things so-and-so did. We want to tell you what we wish people would give us more. We want that. Please, goodness, find someone who's in your area that you work with or that you want to work with. Feed them and pick their brain. It's an excellent, excellent resource. Next, join an organization. Whether it's a professional organization or an informal group of some kind, join them. Sometimes there's special prices for affiliates, meaning I'm not a doctor, but I want to know doctor stuff. Sometimes there are cheaper prices for those. Sometimes you can get on listservs where like smart people tip questions off of each other, and you can be one of those smart people and help each other out. Listservs are fantastic ways to brainstorm, and they're fantastic ways to get additional information. And then finally, read. As attorneys, that's what our bread and butter is. We read, we argue. Read cases. Read the cases that involve experts, even if those experts aren't mental health experts, because how you deal with your expert is going to be very similar to that, but have a special bend to it because of the mental health need. Really, what it comes down to is, as attorneys, it's our job to be the last line of defense. If somebody has gotten to us and they're unserved, we need to do something about it if we can, and we need to protect their rights, and they have a right to their own health. They have a right to that. All right, I'm not going to talk about whether we have a right to health care or not, but we have a right to try to be healthy. All right? We don't want to penalize people for things that are not their fault. And for the most part, the people that are finding us, particularly people that have not been diagnosed, people that have not gotten into the system, because maybe they're really good at living with their disorders. All right, when you catch those people, do everything that you can within their means to direct them the right way. Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, I'm Andrew Hendra, and I'm the editor-in-chief of WMU Cooley Law Review. The next panelist we have is Milton Mack, Jr., who was appointed state court administrator in 2015. Judge Mack previously served as Wayne County probate judge from 1990 to 2015, in which he was chief judge from 1998 to 2015, and served as Wayne County commissioner from 1983 to 1990. Currently, Judge Mack serves as a member of Governor Snyder's Mental Health Division Council. He also served on Governor Granholm's Michigan Mental Health Commission, Judicial Crossroads Task Force, and 21st Century Task Force of the State Bar of Michigan, the Judicial Needs Assessment Committee of the Michigan Supreme Court, the Michigan Partners in Crisis Public Policy Committee, and the Michigan Supreme Court Guardianship Task Force. In 2014, Judge Mack received the Mental Health Champion Award from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. He also received the Frank J. Calley Public Service Award, the Treat Award for Excellence, the Tom Bradley Leadership Award, and was named one of the 25 leaders in law by Michigan Lawyers Weekly.
Well, thank you. And let me just start by saying that I agree with Lieutenant Governor on pretty much everything he had to say. So I could sit down right now, but I'll carry on anyway. But he was correct that for the vast majority of people who are no longer institutionalized by virtue of their mental illness have survived successfully, and they are doing well. I'm going to talk about the people that didn't work for them. And the evidence is the fact that for them, our jails and prisons are the new institutions for people with mental illness. I ran across an interesting number the other day that 40% of the people in America who have a serious mental illness have spent time in a jail or a prison. In Michigan, the number of seriously mentally ill people in our state prison system is continuing to grow in absolute numbers, despite the fact that the prison population has gone from 50,000 to 40,000. Persons with serious mental illness in our state prisons now total nearly 23%. And the evidence is that prisoners with serious mental illness do poorly in prison. They're more likely to return to prison or become homeless. They serve longer sentences, receive more probation and parole violations, account for more prison infractions, and are more likely to be placed in solitary confinement or commit suicide. 1 in 10 police calls across the country now involve mental health situations. People with mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed than any other civilians when approached or stopped by law enforcement. All of this happens despite the fact that with timely treatment, most mental illness is treatable and recovery is possible, reducing the likelihood of criminal behavior that can lead to incarceration. I'm going to talk about the rigid legal standards for ordering involuntary treatment and the lack of an adequately funded community-based mental health system that has led to this public safety crisis and public health crisis. In the literally thousands of cases I heard over 25 years on the bench, In all those cases, everyone saw trouble coming, but nothing could be done until the crisis occurred. The way our system is designed, imagine a train going down the tracks. The bridge is out. We have two options here. We can either call the engineer on the train and tell him, bridge is out, stop the train, or we could park ambulances at the bottom of the ravine and pick up the dead and wounded. Our system relies on ambulances picking up the dead and wounded. We do not intervene in a timely fashion. It's ironic that the use of jails and prisons to house persons with mental illness was widespread in this country before 1850. Then the institutional model, which was championed by a Sunday school teacher named Dorothy Dix, led to the idea of having people with mental illness not kept in prison and jail, not kept locked in the attic, not kept in jail cells in the backyard, or cages rather. Instead, built hospitals. In fact, Kalamazoo Regional Psychiatric Hospital was built in the 1850s based on the lobbying efforts of Dorothea Dix. Anyone heard of Dorothea Dix? An amazing woman. She was a Sunday school teacher. She literally crossed the entire country, which fortunately for her only went up the Mississippi River. So it wasn't quite so hard as it is now. But virtually every mental hospital built in the United States at that time was built because of her. She even went to Congress and lobbied them to do something about mental illness. And Congress was so impressed with her, they gave her her own office in the Capitol. And she asked for, I think, 5 million acres of property to be used to fund mental health treatment. Congress gave her 12 million acres of property. And that money and that land was to be used to generate income to pay for treating people with mental illness. The bill passed and went on to Franklin Pierce. Remember him? One of the little known and little remembered presidents we've ever had. And he vetoed the bill. He said the federal government had no role in providing for health in America. That was a state problem. And that was actually the very last bill passed by Congress dealing with those kinds of issues until FDR was elected president. So the 1960s saw a change to move away from the institutional model to the community treatment and support model. The idea was that people could be taken care of in the community with treatment and support and would not need to be in institutions. And the way to make this happen, Congress agreed that they would help pay for the services for those persons as long as they weren't in the hospital. And so Congress, realizing, or rather state legislatures realizing they would not have to pay for this anymore if they could transfer the cost to the federal government, decided this is a good time to start emptying our hospitals. So legislators across the country recognized this. And the result was changing the way we financed mental health across America. Before that time, we had a public mental health system. And that meant the system helped you regardless of your income. We moved to a Medicaid model health system, which means that we'll take care of you as long as you're poor enough. And if you're not poor enough yet, as soon as your illness gets bad enough and you're poor enough, now we'll take care of you. Because if you're not poor enough, you're not going to get timely treatment. It also helped that in 1975, the U.S. Supreme Court decided O'Connor versus Donaldson, which held that persons could not be held in mental hospitals solely due to mental illness if they were capable of living safely outside the hospital. So between the financing and the Supreme Court decision, states across the nation began enacting new mental health codes that were designed to make it harder to hospitalize people with mental illness. And just to compare, before that time, it was possible to be hospitalized for the rest of your life in a mental hospital based on the affidavit of a doctor without you being present in court. If in 1955, there were about 550,000 people in mental hospitals across America. Today, there are less than 40,000 people in mental hospitals across America. But there are 380,000 people with serious mental illness in prison across America. And every year, 2 million people with mental illness are admitted to our nation's jails and prisons. So, but today, right, starting in the 1990s, we've developed a new model for dealing with mental health, and that's called the recovery model. The recovery model holds that mental illness is treatable, recovery is possible, and persons with mental illness can lead productive, satisfying lives with treatment. And many do. In fact, as the Lieutenant Governor pointed out, most do. However, for those who become incapacitated by their mental illness and don't understand their need for treatment, nothing can be done until they're in crisis, such as becoming homeless or incarcerated. And let me tell you a story. One of my high school friends is a child psychologist. His wife is also a psychologist. They live in Boulder, Colorado. They have 2 sons. Patrick, her oldest son, worked for an international energy firm in Seattle. He was very successful, could play the piano, violin, a virtuoso. So one day my friend calls me and says, Milt, Patrick went to his boss's house for dinner, and when he got there, he started eating their books and telling them there was new parents. So they took him to the hospital. And the hospital said, well, he's not dangerous to himself or others, and let him go. He didn't show up for work for about 3 weeks, so they sent police and fire out to do a safety check. They get out there, bang on the door, can't get in. They gain entrance, and they find Patrick, and he's dancing naked, wearing fairy wings. He won't respond. The fireman reaches out to grab Patrick, and Patrick takes a swing at him. This is an important point in Patrick's life, because across America, what happens, and this happens frequently, a young man like Patrick is either going to jail or the hospital. Which one? Well, most of the time it's jail. Patrick got lucky. They took him to the hospital. And the hospital determined that he was not sufficiently dangerous to himself or others and let him go. So Patrick asked me, what can I do? Or not Patrick, but Bob, my friend asked me, what can I do? And I said, Bob, I'm a judge, lawyer, Michigan. You're a psychologist, for God's sake. If anyone should know what to do, it should be you. But no, so I looked up Seattle's law, and sure enough, it's the same as Michigan. Most of these states are all the same. And told him how to get hold of NAMI, but there's really nothing that could be done. And then eventually, Patrick did manage to get arrested for bad driving, and they decided at that point in Seattle that maybe this was a mental health issue after all, and they filed a petition to have him get treatment. So my friend flies from Boulder to Seattle to attend the hearing. He gets to the hearing, the prosecutor says, I don't think we have a case. And my friend just beats on the prosecutor. No, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. And so the prosecutor finally relents and tries the case. The judge orders treatment. 3 weeks later, Patrick's back to normal. Okay, explain to me why we have to go through this. There's no reason in the world that we should be working like that. But his story is not uncommon at all. He didn't go to jail, at least in the beginning, but the fact that we have so many people with serious mental illness in our prisons and jails is evidence of the fact that we're not intervening in a timely way. The old mental health codes, including Michigan's mental health code, they're inpatient models in an outpatient world. They're focused on preventing hospitalization, not focused on providing treatment for those in need and can't help themselves. So today, they only serve to prevent timely treatment. That's what the codes do, and Michigan's no different. Although Lieutenant Governor Calley was a big help in changing Kevin's law so we can make some modest improvement. But I would contend that the inability of the mental health system to respond timely to mental illness leads to homelessness, poverty, and incarceration. It is not necessary to return to the bad old days of mass hospitalization. That's not required. What is necessary is to develop a comprehensive approach to provide early intervention, diversion programs, mental health courts, better prison conditions, and better reentry programs from jail and prison, including parole and probation. When people are discharged from the hospital with a mental illness, they should go with an assisted outpatient treatment order. And they should get one when they come out of the jail or prison as well. The consequences of this lack of a coordinated approach is felt by the criminal justice system. You heard from here in Ingham County Jail is a classic place. The juvenile justice system, hospital emergency rooms, local police departments, and family members. One of the best things we could do would be to treat mental illness like all other illnesses. For any other illness, if a person becomes incapacitated, the court can appoint a guardian who will make decisions, and those decisions can be pretty significant. But for mental illness, we require more. A more appropriate standard for ordering treatment and for a person with mental illness would be whether they lack the capacity to make an informed decision about that illness, and that treating that illness would restore their capacity to make their own decision, to basically restore their self-determination. I mean, why do we wait to treat someone? The key to the success of the recovery model is timely treatment. We would not wait until stage 4 cancer to intervene. We'd intervene early, when it would be most effective. So we do know, by the way, that delaying treatment damages a person's resiliency when it comes to mental illness. And that's the ability to bounce back from a psychotic episode. So by waiting, we risk permanent incapacity. And waiting for treatment risks unnecessary hospitalization because you wait until things get really bad. Early intervention can be by way of assisted outpatient treatment, which has been proven to be effective at improving self-care, reducing hospitalization, arrest, and incarceration. So, imagine a person with a mental illness who has a serious leg infection. I can appoint a guardian who can decide whether to amputate. But I can't order mental health treatment that might restore the person's capacity to make their own decision about whether to have their leg amputated. The irony is that a guardian can make end-of-life decisions, can make decisions about amputation, any form of treatment, locking someone in an AFC home for years, but can't consent to mental health treatment that would restore the person's capacity to make their own decision and terminate the guardianship. Let me just give you an example of how guardianship works. I'm sitting on the bench one day. A lawyer comes in and he says, Judge, the hospital wants to appoint a guardian for this lady because she's 100 years old and she fell and broke her hip. And she's objecting. The hospital says she has dementia. And I said, well, okay, let's go out and talk to her. So we drove to the hospital, and we go in the room, and the lawyer says, Mrs. Jones, this is Judge Mack. He's hearing your case. And she says, oh, you brought the big guy with you. Yeah, okay. Now, Mrs. Jones, do you know where you are? I'm in Henry Ford Hospital. You know why you're here? Well, yeah, I fell and I broke my hip. Okay, well, they want to do surgery. She says, I know. I said, well, if you don't have the surgery, you may never walk again. And she said, and I might not survive surgery either, right? I said, well, I can't disagree with that. So here she is, oriented to person, place, time. She knows what's wrong with her. She knows the risks and benefit of going forward. She chooses not to go forward. Would that be my decision? I don't know. I'm not in that spot. But it's not going to be my decision because clearly she has the capacity to make an informed decision. She's given evidence of that. She's oriented to person, place, and time. And she knows what's wrong with her. She knows risks and benefit of treatment. In order for me to intervene, you have to show by clear and convincing evidence, the highest standard in the civil justice system, that she can't make those decisions, that she lacks the ability. So I think that if you have someone with a mental illness who is incapacitated by the mental illness, and by the way, the fact you have a mental illness doesn't make you incapacitated. It means you have a mental illness. It's like you have a rash, It doesn't. If you have a mental illness, you're taking care of it, or it's not serious, you're managing, you understand your need for treatment, you can make informed decisions, you don't need me. Frankly, I don't think the Constitution requires that we wait for crisis. That's not what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court in O'Connor, which is always cited all the time that you got to be dangerous, not what it said. The court said, we need not decide whether, when, or by what procedures a mentally ill person may be confined by the state on any of the grounds which under contemporary statutes are generally advanced to justify involuntary confinement of such a person, to prevent injury to the public, to ensure his own survival or safety, or to alleviate or cure his illness. The use of assisted outpatient treatment to alleviate or manage a person's mental illness to restore their capacity to make their own informed decisions in the case of incapacity is certainly a legitimate state interest and is not barred by the Constitution. Thank you very much.
My name is Erin Kane, and I'm the interim symposium editor for WMU Law Review, and I'm here to introduce Mark Reinstein. Mark Reinstein has been employed by the Mental Health Association of Michigan for the past 34 years, directing the organization's public policy efforts and serving as president and CEO of the agency. Mark Reinstein has a bachelor's degree in communication from Michigan State University, a master's in health education from Central Michigan University, and a doctorate in psychological studies from the University of Michigan. He has received many awards for outstanding advocacy from many different organizations, his most recent being in 2015 from Governor Snyder and Lieutenant Governor Calley. Mark has written and spoken extensively on mental health issues in Michigan. In 2000 and in 2001, he was the lead author of 2 major multi-organization reports on the status of publicly funded mental health services in Michigan. So please let me welcome Mark Reinstein.
Good afternoon, and thank you. The Mental Health Association in Michigan is the state's oldest advocacy organization for persons experiencing mental illness. We're in our 80th year. And no, I haven't been there all 80 years. We're a nonprofit agency. We engage in policy analysis and advocacy with state government on mental health issues. We believe we can do the greatest good for the greatest number that way because, as you've probably picked up already today, mental health is an area heavily regulated by law, even to the point where someone's freedom can be taken away because of the severity of his or her mental health condition. You heard Judge Mack reference the Michigan Mental Health Code. There are hundreds of pages of state laws related to mental health in that document. There are also numerous other applicable state and federal laws, for example, those having to do with Medicaid. You heard Judge Mack say that Medicaid is now the dominant financing model for mental health services. So to give you a better illustration of the critical importance of governmental impact on mental health, I'm going to summarize the number one issue in the mental health field in Michigan at this moment. Lieutenant Governor Calley talked about this for 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to go into more detail. And that is the so-called privatization or Section 298 issue. Michigan presently appropriates about $2.5 billion a year for Medicaid specialty services for mental illness, developmental disability, and substance use disorder. These dollars go to 46 community mental health programs and 10 regional offices that help the CMH programs apply managed care procedures to their Medicaid appropriations. You heard the Lieutenant Governor refer to them as PIHPs, Prepaid Inpatient Health Plans. Very strange name, but that's their name nonetheless. The CMH programs in these regional offices are officially connected to government by law. They aren't limited to only serving Medicaid beneficiaries, but consistent with what Judge Mack told you, the way things are these days, the vast amount of their money comes from Medicaid. Now, the state also appropriates many billions of dollars more than the $2.5 billion to 11 Medicaid HMOs, also known as Medicaid health plans or MHPs. These are private, often for-profit entities, not officially part of government, that use managed care techniques to administer the so-called physical health services, as well as a limited potential mental health benefit for mild to moderate psychiatric conditions for over 75% of Michigan Medicaid beneficiaries. We have between 75 and 80% of our Medicaid people in Michigan enrolled in those MHPs. Because of the vagaries of all sorts of federal rules and regulations, there are still between 20 to 25% of Medicaid recipients in the state who are under the old style fee-for-service system. Now, there were some comments and questions about this so-called 20-visit benefit for mental health earlier today that the Medicaid health plans can provide. And it was misleading. It sounded like anyone that they've got who has a mental health condition will get 20 outpatient visits. And then, if there's still a need that year, that they'll be moved, or they'll try to be moved, to community mental health. That's not how it works. The MHPs are funded to provide up to 20 visits in a year for conditions deemed to be mild or moderate. If you've got schizophrenia, forget about the 20 visits. You should be referred to community mental health immediately. If you've got bipolar disorder, major depression, you should be referred to community mental health immediately. It's up to 20 visits for mild to moderate conditions. And let me give you some numbers from the State Department of Health and Human Services. For those who do get that benefit in the Medicaid health plans, the average number of visits is not 20, it's 4. That's pathetic. Also, for those people who get that benefit, and again, this comes from the State Department of Health and Human Services, 10% of the visits are with a psychiatrist, neurologist, psychologist, or social worker. 90% are at levels below that. Once again, that is pathetic. So to sum up where we've been, we've had 2 multi-billion-dollar pots of money regarding Medicaid health care. The smaller of the 2 buckets has been for specialized behavioral health care. The second bucket, with a lot more money, has essentially been for Medicaid beneficiaries' other medical care. About 15 months ago, Governor Snyder recommended that all community mental health Medicaid money and service management responsibility should be transferred from community mental health to the MHPs. In other words, the MHPs would be responsible for everything, including specialized behavioral health services for serious behavioral health disorders. That set off a firestorm of protest, and the state wound up establishing 3 separate steps of review and analysis. At every step, the governor's recommendation was rejected. First, as you heard from the lieutenant governor, he had a work group, largest work group I've ever been on, 120 people, that ran to June of 16. It recommended that if any single entity were going to hold all Medicaid health care money for persons enrolled with both MHPs and CMH programs, that entity should be the CMH side, not the MHP side. Next, in the fall of 16, the state organized 45 public meetings across Michigan. 2/3 of these were targeted for Medicaid service recipients and their families. In these total 45 sessions, over 1,100 people attended, with over 700 of those being consumers and families. These people who depend on mental health services and supports clearly and overwhelmingly stated they did not want MHPs managing their behavioral health care. That doesn't mean those people were or are in love with community mental health. They're not. There are problems there. It is not as good a system as it could be or it should be. But what they were recognizing was that if they think they've got problems now, they know it's going to be worse if these private, often for-profit entities are responsible for managing their care. Finally, the state had oh, and by the way, in the 14 public meetings that were for service providers and payers, not for consumers and families, not a one of those 14 recommended the governor's proposal. Then the state had a 23-person work group develop reports with recommendations for the legislature. These were delivered in January and in March of this year. The most significant recommendation in those reports called for continuing to have separately funded and managed systems for publicly funded health care, community mental health for specialty behavioral care, and the MHPs for other medical care. The work group also recommended more jointly shared programming between community mental health and the MHPs for shared enrollees, for people who are enrolled in both. You'd think that would be the end of the story, right? Well, no, it hasn't been. The MHPs and the trade association most of them belong to have put a full court press on legislators. And some of those legislators, including 3 key ones for health appropriations, have received a lot in mental health, in MHP and private insurance contributions over the years. Michigan Public Radio and the Michigan Campaign Finance Network did a joint story on that, ballpark maybe 3 weeks ago. Nothing illegal about that, but the fact is there. And on the advocacy side, we can't make contributions to legislators. Even if we could, none of us have the money to do that. So what we have now in the House and Senate health budgets for next year, which are not final yet, because there's differences, has to go to conference committee. But what we have right now from both the House and the Senate is language directing that there be pilot programs in some parts of the state where MHPs receive, control, and manage all Medicaid mental health money. In the House budget, there's also a recommendation for something the Lieutenant Governor briefly mentioned, that Michigan ought to work toward trying to go from 10 of these regional prepaid inpatient health plans to 1. That one piece of what's there is fine with the advocacy community as long as that one statewide managed care entity to assist the CMHs is public, is governmental. But the rest of what's in the House and Senate budgets right now would be a disaster for people with major mental illness and other serious behavioral disorders. Their access to care will be rationed even more than it is today, so that the private plans can make money off of my constituents' situations. It'll also create a situation where the managers of their behavioral health care will be parties that have little experience in dealing with severe behavioral disorders and have little experience with modern mental health recovery concepts like person-centered planning, self-determination, and the use of community supports like housing, transportation, employment, education, to be part of someone's recovery package. Finally, it'll create a legal and bureaucratic mess across the state, with folks in different locations being responded to differently, unequally, if you will, by public funding. If in large portions of the state, for the foreseeable future, we have things the way they are now, but in X number of portions around the state, we have these so-called pilots where the Medicaid health plans would control everything. So despite all that's happened the last 15 months, the involvement of over 1,000 state citizens and action by the legislature can dictate something that mental health consumers, families, and advocates are united in opposing, and that no one outside of the profit-seeking insurance industry wants. And if that isn't one of the starkest indications I can give you of how mental health is heavily regulated by law, setting the table for what can and can't happen to vulnerable people who often lack ample personal resources to go out and take care of these things on their own, away from public funds, then I don't know what is. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reinstein. My name is Eric Nordan, and along with Tiffany Shelton and Brandon Grisco, we are the team on Law Review that reaches out to authors and asks them if they'd like to publish with us. So if that's something of interest to anyone, please find either us or some member of Law Review. That's what we do. It's my very great pleasure to announce our final panelist, Professor Lauren Rousseau. Professor Rousseau has been on faculty with Cooley since 2004 and has pages and pages of honors, awards, accolades, community involvement. But one of the most important things I'd like to say about her is she's a wonderful friend and an incredible mentor, and is going to talk on something that's very, very important to all of us. Professor.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Eric. And thank you to the Law Review for inviting me to speak on an issue that's really important to me. I'm going to try to figure out first how to do what I need to do here to get to this little PowerPoint presentation I put together. I did it, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about what I think is really the greatest mental health challenge of our time, both nationally and also in the state of Michigan. And it's an issue that has been mentioned in one form or another by every one of our speakers today. And that is addiction, and in particular, opioid use disorder. And I want to start this talk by asking the people in this room, how many of you have been personally impacted by addiction, either because you struggled with it yourself or because you dealt with it in a family member or a friend? So wow, a lot of hands coming up, and that kind of shows, it emphasizes my point about this being a very significant issue that we're dealing with in our community. I was actually surprised that there was no hesitation with some of you in terms of raising your hand, and I wonder if all of you who actually have been impacted raised your hand just now, because we all know that mental health issues generally and addiction specifically are saddled with a stigma in our community. I believe that Lieutenant Governor Calley mentioned that in his remarks, although I wasn't here to hear them. But that stigma really creates a barrier to people recognizing addiction in themselves, being willing to reach out to treatment if they need it. It prevents families from reaching out for help and support because there is this sense in our community regarding addiction specifically, mental health generally, that kind of goes along with a negative thing, a negative aspect of it. With addiction specifically, there's sort of many segments of our community who will say that the issue is lack of strength, right? It's weakness. You don't have the willpower to not use. Or that you're basically making a morally deprived choice, and it's evidence of a morally bankrupt character. There's a lot of those types of comments that I see in response to articles that I read that deal with the subject of addiction. And it also is a sentiment that pervades our society enough that I think it kind of drives the war on drugs, the failed war on drugs, where we have for so long sought to incarcerate our way out of addiction rather than treat addiction. In fact, since as far back as the mid-1950s, addiction has been recognized by the medical community as a disease. It has been defined by the National Institute on Drug Abuse as a chronic relapsing brain disease characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. The American Society of Addiction Medicine identifies some specific behaviors that go along with it with this disease, such as the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of problems with behaviors in interpersonal relationships, a dysfunctional emotional response. So basically, this is something that works within the person, and the drug use that creates this essential rewiring of the brain and drives a lot of these behaviors. Now, you all know, I'm sure, because you've read about it in the media, we're kind of inundated by the issues relating to addiction at this point, that we are in the midst of an epidemic, right? An addiction epidemic, and more specifically, an opioid epidemic. I wanted to share with all of you some specific statistics that kind of identify exactly how significant this problem is, in part because I find the statistics shocking, and I think that you might as well. So, starting with this one. This graph basically demonstrates national overdose deaths from all drugs from 2002 to 2015. During that time period, overdose deaths in this country more than doubled. In 2015, we experienced as a country 52,404 drug overdose deaths. Now, to put that into some perspective, deaths by car accident in the same year were 38,000. Deaths by guns, including homicide and suicide, so gun violence, 36,000. So quite a bit more in terms of overdose deaths than those other types of death. And if you put it in slightly different numbers that are shocking in their own way, 144 people per day died of died of drug overdose in 2015. Now, I kind of slipped there and said opioids. Let's look at deaths from opioid drugs. Basically, opioid drugs are widely viewed and recognized as driving our current addiction problem, or addiction epidemic. So let me explain first a little bit about what opioid drugs are. These include prescription medications as well as illicit heroin and fentanyl. So the types of prescription medications we're talking about are things like Vicodin, Percocet, Lortab, OxyContin. These are all opioid drugs that are really similar in makeup and act on the opioid receptors in the brain in the exact same way that heroin does. So you're talking about different strengths with respect to these types of drugs, but you can get addicted to any of them. The addiction rate with respect to opioid medications and drugs generally is high. And, if you can't get one and you're addicted to it, then you could interchange it with something else, and that's part of what is driving this epidemic. So you can see here the sort of exponential increase in overdose deaths as a result of opioid drugs from 2002 to 2015. In 2015, there were 33,000, or just over actually, 33,000 deaths as a result of all opioids. So that would include heroin as well as prescription medications. That's 63% of the overdose deaths from all drugs. And from 2002 to 2015, deaths from opioids almost tripled. Again, to put it in sort of the per-day terminology, there are 91 overdose deaths per day using 2015 numbers as a result of all opioid drugs. Now, let me just add that last week, I read a report that was issued by the Federal Center for Disease Control suggesting that these numbers are too low. They had just recently done a study in Minnesota where they discovered that a number of deaths, a significant number, had been mischaracterized as resulting from pneumonia and other infectious diseases because those diseases were the person had those illnesses at the time that they died, but opioids were clearly a factor with respect to those deaths. So the CDC is suspecting that what they saw in Minnesota is something that is also happening around the country. So again, the numbers are probably worse than what you're seeing on this chart. So let's talk about why this is happening. Largely, this opioid epidemic that we're currently seeing has been driven by excessive prescribing of opioid medications by doctors. This chart kind of demonstrates what's happened in terms of opioid sales, the sales of opiate prescription drugs from 1999 up to 2010. So the green line shows the sales, right? Exponentially climbing. And you see right under that, the red line are opiate overdose deaths climbing right along with
The conference will expire momentarily.
Admissions for treatment for opioid addiction. So why did this happen? Well, in the mid-1990s, the medical community reached the conclusion that we were in this country under-treating pain, in particular chronic pain. And they began considering the use of opioid medications to deal with chronic pain, which they hadn't done before.
The conference has expired.
Around the same time, Purdue Pharma developed an extended-release opioid medication called OxyContin. They started marketing this drug for use with respect to chronic pain and for treating chronic pain. And they relied on one particular study that was ultimately discredited that indicated that when opioid medications are prescribed for pain, you don't have an addiction problem. That basically you had virtually non-addicted, like 1% of people would become addicted to this drug. That particular medical study was debunked, ultimately. In fact, opioid medications
Welcome to the conference.
addictive. What happened? Did I just lose my slide?
I think they're working on it.
Oh, okay. I was wondering. Suddenly everyone's leaving. I'm a bit distracted by everyone walking out the door. In any event, I'll finish what I'm saying, and then I'll hesitate before I go to the next slide. So, where was I? On why this happened. So, Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies began marketing their opioid medications for treatment of chronic pain and basically representing that they're not addictive or virtually not addictive when they're being prescribed for pain. And so you see an exponential increase in the prescription of those medications, and people started dying. And so, in fact, it was ultimately, again, determined that, the opioid medications are significantly addictive. But by that time, you had a whole generation of doctors who've been trained to prescribe opioid medications in this way, and so trying to contain that has been difficult. There has been increasing recognition of. Do we have my slides back, or almost?
I sent somebody to check. If it won't bother you, I can try to fiddle around with it while you're speaking. Don't expect great things from me.
Professor Rousseau?
Yes.
I was just going to ask you a question while we have time.
Okay.
So what exactly is being done with these doctors that are overprescribing opioids to people?
I was just getting to that.
Oh.
Does it matter?
Well, then I'm sorry.
So actually, let me answer that question and kind of get into that a little bit. Oh, there we go with the slides.
Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so over time, it kind of dawns on the medical community, the community at large, that maybe the prescribing of these opioid medications isn't such a great idea, and we need to start reining that in. In March 2016, and you have to kind of wonder why it took so long for this to happen, the Federal Center for Disease Control issued new guidelines, the first ever guidelines related to prescribing opioid medications. And so these guidelines basically instructed doctors to, advise patients of the potential dangers of opioid medications, recommended that for chronic pain you look to other possible alternatives rather than turning to opioids right off the bat. And if you do opioids, try to give the lowest effective amount. And for chronic pain, for acute pain, the recommendation is don't prescribe more than 7 days worth or less, right? Now the problem, of course, is that these are recommendations. This is nothing that is required. They're not mandated. Doctors don't have to, go along and comply with this. So some of the states are picking up the slack. Recently, 10 states over the course of the past year or so have enacted legislation that basically says for first-time opioid prescribing, you're not allowed to prescribe more than 7 days worth of opioid medications. New Jersey took one step further and limited it to 5 days. So basically and oftentimes, if you go into a doctor's office, you walk out with 30 pills. I mean, it's not a surprising thing to have happen. These, the CDC is recommending against that, and these states have now enacted legislation that basically says you can't prescribe more than 7 for a first-time opiate prescription. And now in New Jersey, 5 is the limit, right? 5 days or less. Michigan currently has a bill pending in the legislature dealing with this issue that is basically, the bill would provide for limiting first-time opiate prescriptions to 7 days. if it passes. So the slide that I wanted to get to before I even got into that detail was this one. The chart I showed you went up to 2010. This goes to 2012. So this is a map of the United States as of 2012. And it shows the number of opioid prescriptions per 100 people. And you notice the ones in dark purple there, they're the ones that basically have more opioid prescriptions than people. We're one of them, right? So Michigan falls into that category. This was 2012. As I said, there's been a growing realization that this opioid prescribing is driving the opioid epidemic. So doctors, to some degree, are trying to rein it in, prescribe a bit less, right? And you do see that reflected a bit in overdose deaths due to prescription opioid pain relievers. They climb up to 2010, and then you see the first dip in 2011, right? And they drop down a little bit more in 2013. They kind of remained relatively flat. Still horribly high, but no longer climbing, right? So while this is going on, though, during this time frame, you have this. So you see the drop in overdose deaths as a result of prescription medications right around 2011, but boom, right around 2011, exponential through-the-roof climb in terms of number of overdose deaths nationally due to heroin. And there was a six-fold increase from 2002 to 2015 in overdose deaths due to heroin. In 2015, there were just under 13,000 deaths as a result of heroin. And this is only heroin. So this doesn't include a lot of what you've been hearing about in the media recently, which is fentanyl. Fentanyl is much stronger than heroin and has been coming into the black market and being, some of heroin's being cut with it. Some people are doing straight fentanyl, and people are dying from this because of the strength of it. If you include fentanyl, the number goes up from 13,000 to 22,569 people who died from these illicit opioids. And there was a 73% increase in opioid deaths in 2015 as a result of fentanyl, up to 9,500. One other little statistical fact to throw out there that kind of goes in line with all these charts that I've been showing you. 2015 was the first year in 20 years where life expectancy in the United States went down. So all other developed countries, the life expectancy continues to climb. Ours dropped in 2015 for the first time in 20 years. And a lot of that is driven by all the deaths you're seeing as a result of drug overdose. Now, one more chart of statistics, and that's Michigan. So, we've been talking about, national statistics. In Michigan, you can see there's also the trajectory of overdose deaths. The total overdose deaths, or deaths from all drugs, you can see are the green line, and then the blue line is opioids, and the red line is heroin. This chart goes only through 2014. In 2014, there were 1,762 deaths in the state as a result of drug overdose. That jumped 13% in 2015, so we had 1,980, and just over 1,300 of those deaths were due to opioids. So 66% of the total overdose deaths in 2015 in Michigan were a result of opioid drugs, including heroin. We don't know the numbers yet for 2016. These are the official numbers. We only have them through 2015, but we are getting some information from some of the counties of preliminary 2016 numbers. I was recently told that the Wayne County Medical Examiner released preliminary numbers for Wayne County that shows a 56% increase in drug overdose deaths in that county in 2016 over 2015. So we're likely to see things being a whole lot worse, the numbers a whole lot worse in 2016. So what are we doing about this? There are a whole lot of things that are happening, both at the government level and among community organizations, in order to try to make a difference with respect to this. I'm just going to mention a couple things, and then I want to mention a particular issue and a sort of community-government partnership that is a possible solution. First of all, Governor Snyder created the Prescription Drug and Opioid Task Force in June 2015 that was chaired by Lieutenant Governor Calley. In October 2015, they released recommendations, 25 primary recommendations and 7 contingent recommendations for addressing this epidemic. Those recommendations were grouped into 5 categories: prevention, treatment, regulation, policy, and enforcement. There's currently 5 different state agencies that are working on implementing all of these different recommendations, and that task force that I mentioned has been sort of recreated into a more permanent structure as a commission, the Prescription Drug and Opioid Abuse Commission. So again, they're focusing on a whole variety of things. I'm just going to mention a couple. One of them is education. Prevention is huge among our youth, helping them understand the dangers of prescription opioid use in the community generally, as well as the dangers of addiction related to these drugs. Educating doctors is important, and that's an important part of the recommendations. You need to educate doctors not just in terms of the dangers of prescribing opioid use, but also to be able to recognize addiction when it comes into their office. Medical doctors on a regular rotation, primary doctors get about an hour of training in medical school on addiction. So in terms of being able to assess someone coming in to a primary care doctor and recognize that they have an issue and hopefully head it off early often doesn't happen. So part of what this education is focused on that, right? Part of the education is focused on that. Another thing that's happening is improved access to naloxone. You guys know what naloxone? Everyone who doesn't know what naloxone is? Quite a few. How about Narcan? Have you heard of that? So naloxone, brand name is Narcan. It's an opiate overdose reversal drug. And so basically, if someone is overdosed and at the point of death as a result of opioids, you can administer a shot of Narcan, sometimes multiple shots, depending on the extent of the drug in their system, and you can revive them. You basically reverse the overdose. This is a drug that is basically safe to administer, and now you have it in nasal form as well as by injection, and there's even an auto-injector that is on the market now. Community organizations have been working for a long time to be able to train and provide this medication to families who have family members who are struggling with opiate addiction or addicts themselves. I know a lot of community organizations that conduct these trainings regularly and have grants to get the naloxone, and they can basically hand it out. One of the things that's been a priority over the past few years is getting it to first responders. You know, the folks in the ambulance have it, the EMTs have it, but police officers often don't. Fire department often they don't. And they're the ones who are first responding to an overdose. And when you're dealing with an overdose, time is of the essence, right? So more and more first responders are being equipped with and trained how to use naloxone. And this is part of these recommendations that was made by this task force that I mentioned. Okay, so there are a lot of other things that I could share with you. I really would prefer like a couple hours to have this conversation, but I'm going to cut out everything else that I was talking about that I would otherwise talk about, all the other recommendations and stuff, and just talk about one more issue and one more possible solution. You can imagine that because there are increasing numbers of people who are struggling with opioid addiction and who are needing treatment, we have a problem now with enough treatment beds. That's a huge problem. There simply aren't enough treatment beds in inpatient settings to treat all the people who are needing treatment. And when you're dealing with somebody, there's also, as I point up there, there's no central point of access. So, you know, you are struggling with addiction, you're sick, you're desperate, and you're like making phone calls and you're not sure who to call or where to call, and they keep telling you, yeah, we'll have something for you in 30 days, or we'll have something for you in 2 weeks. And, you know, the family members get exhausted if they're trying to help. It's a really frustrating system from that standpoint. The other thing to know about addiction is you can't tell an addict to wait. I mean, basically, you tell someone to wait 2 weeks. This is a person who, they're coming into treatment because they can't stop, right? There are also physical withdrawal symptoms that happen with respect to opiate addiction that are pretty horrific, and a person is going to keep trying to use or keep using in order to stave off those withdrawal symptoms until they can get into treatment. So if you tell someone to wait for 2 weeks, they're going to continue using every day, and they may die in that time period. Not to mention, another thing that kind of happens with addiction is you have sort of a moment of clarity, where you suddenly, things have gotten so bad, it's like, okay, I give up, I surrender, I'm ready for treatment. And then you call and they say, wait 2 weeks, and you kind of hang on to the idea for a day or two, and then you just kind of get back into your addiction and you kind of forget about it. So you could lose the person from that standpoint as well. So the idea of this current system where we have this waiting period is really intolerable. Also, if you think about the fact that addiction is a disease, would you tell someone who's having a heart attack to come back in 2 weeks? Would you tell someone who's been diagnosed as cancer we'll give you a treatment bed and we'll start treatment in 30 days? You wouldn't. There's no other disease that you would treat this way. So this is something that's not tolerable, and community organizations, interestingly enough, are coming to the fore to try to find a solution to this. There is a program that was launched in Michigan in February called Hope Not Handcuffs. It has been led by Families Against Narcotics, which is an organization that I'm involved with. Families Against Narcotics is an organization that has 14 chapters around the state. I'm the president of a chapter that started in Wayne County in April. It provides resources, education, and support to families who are affected with addiction, and they do other really amazing, cool things like this. The main branch of Family Against Narcotics is in Macomb County. They reached out and partnered with law enforcement, the police departments there, as well as treatment providers, and also people who are willing to volunteer to create sort of a central point where addicts seeking recovery can come and get, hopefully, immediate referrals to treatment, can immediately get into treatment. Basically how this works is the police department is the central point. If you're an addict in Macomb County and you're struggling with addiction and you want help, you can walk into a police department, scary thought if you're an addict, right? Walk into a police department with your drugs, paraphernalia, whatever, and basically say, I want help, right? I need help. And they've got a point person there who will call Families Against Narcotics. They have a list of volunteers that they refer to as angels, and they'll have one of their angels come over and immediately meet with that person. They've also affiliated with all these treatment providers that person will then call, sit with the person dealing with addiction, who's afflicted with this condition, and make those phone calls and get that person into treatment. Currently, there are 250 angels in Macomb County. There's 300 participating treatment providers, and as of yesterday, they've placed 189 people since February, and most of them in under 2 hours. So Families Against Narcotics is working to push this through other counties. It's completely in Macomb County, but they also have it in Ferndale and Harper Woods. We are already working in Wayne County to try to create the situation. It's a fantastic, exciting program that's getting addicts the help that they need. The sad part about it is we shouldn't really need this, right? I mean, we need the police department to be the one who's intervening to be able to be a center point for people to get treatment. What other illness would you be doing that for, right? Kind of crazy, but at least we have this, right? The last thing I want to say, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I haven't been watching the clock. Am I good? Okay, so the very last thing that I want to share with you is a little bit of my personal story. So I'm a civil procedure professor at a law school. A history of having litigated, been a employment litigation, class action work, various other things. Why am I so interested and engaged with respect to this issue? And I think that you all can tell that I am very passionate about this issue. In 2010, I became the legal guardian for a young man who was my youngest son's best friend. They had been best friends since about 6th grade. I'd spent a lot of time with this young man. He'd been on vacation with us, that type of thing. We were all very close. His mother died in 2010, so I ended up taking him in. He sort of became a part of our family. I became his bonus mom. He became my bonus son. He was unable really to cope with his grief over his mother's death. She was kind of like the light of his life. And over the next couple of years, he sort of descended into drug addiction and ultimately heroin addiction. I didn't realize how serious or how bad the problem was, and I was also woefully uneducated really on the subject of addiction generally. I came home in October 2011 to find him sitting in his Escape in my driveway shooting up. So needless to say, I freaked out. And in fairly short order, I sort of strong-armed him into an outpatient treatment program, which is kind of my first mistake, because a 19-year-old IV heroin addict is not going to be able to, get into recovery through an outpatient program. But I didn't really understand that at the time. So within 3 weeks, he was kicked out for using. I also wasn't given that information because HIPAA prevents, the privacy laws prevent family from being able to know what's going on with the person. Another thing we have to change when you're dealing with mental illness. I found out after the fact why he was kicked out. Within the next couple of weeks, thankfully, he stole a video game from Walmart and was arrested, which gave me the leverage that I needed in order to sort of strong arm him into an inpatient program. So he ended up in Brighton Center for Recovery for 12 days. My insurance only covered 12 days. Another huge problem. You are not going to get anywhere in terms of healing an addicted brain in 12 days, particularly when you're dealing with a 19-year-old ID heroin addict. He used the day he got out. I didn't know that he did. I learned that 2 days later when I found him passed out in bed with a needle on the floor. I battled with him for about a week after that to try to get him to follow the aftercare program that Brighton Center for Recovery had given him. He was reluctant to do that, and so I ultimately told him he had to leave my home. Within 4 or 5 days of that, at midnight, I began getting text messages from him threatening to commit suicide. So we turned that around, and the next day got him into another treatment center in Maple Grove, again for 12 days. This time when he got out of Maple Grove, he made it almost to 48 hours before he relapsed and started using, and within a week of that point, he was dead. So he didn't actually die of an overdose, which sort of underscores the fact that these numbers are probably an understatement of the effect of addiction. His active addiction took him to a place where he was murdered. So because of that, this is an issue that is obviously very near and dear to my heart, and it's why I do a lot of work in this area currently. We are losing a whole generation of young people to this disease. It's reached a point, and I know from the hands that everyone raised, that it's pretty much touched us all in some way or another. Everybody knows somebody who's been afflicted with this. It's everybody's problem, and we need to come together as a community to solve it. Thank you.
Well, this has really been terrific, and of course we are over time, but I know you patiently listened to all of these speakers, and some of you may have questions. Are the panelists able to stay for a little bit if there are some questions? Of course, we recognize that you may not be able to stay. We appreciate your patience, but we could at this time take some questions. Would anybody like to ask anyone something? Yes.
Mr. Davis, you had spoken quite a bit about how you don't have enough funding at the Ingham County Jail. And it was also mentioned by several others that funding is an issue. Now, because all these programs are government sponsored, you don't have a lot of money to help you work with the legislature to increase that funding, or have you worked with the community mental health?
Through the Michigan Sheriff's Association, we have a lobbyist,
right.
And so, Ben Botkin is doing as much as he can trying to lobby for us, but still we're short in funds.
Okay. Because I know that there's always a negative connotation with lobbyists and lawyers. But anyway, I mean, that's just the root of the evil is you have to lobby with the legislature in order to get that extra funds because they are the purse. So I was just curious to know if you had worked with that. But you have.
Working with that. And again, the number of FTEs that are available, and the commissioners have priorities too. We're competing within our own county for county dollars, and should more county dollars go to the medical wing. And I don't mean this to be funny, but county dollars to the parks, I mean, the zoo is important to a lot of folks, county dollars to the animal shelter. I mean, people are very passionate about those things, and in many cases people are not as passionate about inmates.
Right.
I had a question for Professor Rousseau, and I don't even know if you'll know this, but it's my understanding that when heroin addicts go for help to a rehab center, they're put on a drug to kind of wean them off heroin, and I've heard that some of them actually can get addicted to that drug. So I'm wondering, is that something that works, or is...
You're talking about buprenorphine, which is also kind of sort of more commonly known as Suboxone, although that's the generic name of the other varieties of it. And different, a lot of treatment centers are now using it for the detox, so they use it short term. Because they're using it only for a few days, you're not going to develop an addiction. But if you use it long term, will you become addicted to it? Essentially, yes. Buprenorphine is an opiate. A synthetic opiate is kind of similar to methadone, slightly different in makeup. It's what's referred to as a partial opioid agonist rather than a full opioid agonist, which is what methadone and heroin both are. The partial opioid agonist, the idea that there is it fully attaches to the opioid receptor but doesn't deliver the full same amount of euphoric effect as you would get if it was a full opioid agonist, which means you're less likely to overdose and there's sort of a ceiling on the euphoric effect. So a lot of people are giving that drug. It's kind of it's becoming more and more sort of pushed almost from the top down as the ideal way to treat opioid addiction. The suggestion is you shouldn't just use it briefly for detox, but you should use it long-term for maintenance. If you use it long-term for maintenance, absolutely, you are addicted to it, essentially. Addiction and physical dependence are two different things. So addiction is sort of like the psychological craving and all the things we talked about before. Anyone who uses an opioid for any length of time, pain management, whatever, is going to develop a physical dependency. And so you're going to need to...
The conference will expire in 5 minutes.
The same would be true with Suboxone. It is very controversial in the treatment community as to whether using buprenorphine for long-term, like maintenance, is good or bad. I mean, there's battle that the addiction doctors and the science, they'll point to the science saying it's totally the way to go. So many treatment providers are resistant to it. It's really a contentious issue. But not so much for the detox. When you talk about going into a treatment center and having it just for a few days to help kind of step you down off of the really vicious, horrible withdrawal effects of an opioid instead of going cold turkey, that I don't think is very controversial. That's not a big deal. It's if you have it longer term that then you can stop taking that without having the withdrawal effects just as you would if you got off heroin.
Any other questions? Yes.
My question kind of stems from what Beverly was talking about lawyers, prepping their case, finding the experts, learning from the experts, and narrowing the issue. And this question I think can be answered by all of you here on the panel. I know it's suggested if we as lawyers have questions about these mental health issues, ask an expert, join an organization, read cases about it. What organizations do you suggest? Is there a clinic at the school or something that can teach us lawyering skills for cases that involve mental health issues? Are there organizations that you would suggest? I don't know if my question makes sense or if it's too broad.
No, NAMI is a national organization that NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, which is online. We have the Treatment Advocacy Center. They're another organization that advocates treatment for people with mental illness. And then, if you want to go the other way, there's the Bazelon Center, BACLR, who traditionally have opposed involuntary treatment period, which I think is short-sighted and gives him more work to do because he can't get help. But there's probably the 3 largest national organizations that focus on the mental health issue.
Does the state bar do any trainings that might relate to this?
The state bar doesn't do any specific trainings that are related to mental health care or mental health advocacy in the legal system, which I think is a great failure of our profession. We have to find people to write stuff that we then sort of push through the ABA and they will stamp their name on, but not actually take the 2-day on-hands training, experiential sort of a seminar. It's not something that they offer, and it's very unfortunate because with the addiction epidemics going on and the crises in prisons that attorneys are raving about, it just seems very unrealistic that we are not training people in order to operate efficiently and navigate within the system that we are complaining about. And it's leading our profession to a place where new attorneys and even attorneys that are changing fields have no idea what to do when they encounter this kind of thing. And these are great organizations, and NAMI is fantastic, absolutely fantastic, and it's a shame that we have to sort of go to other professions to teach us
But I don't think we do. You know, you can get involved with the State Bar of Michigan and you can join those sections, even as a law student, like the health law section. You can join the juvenile law section. And once you're active in a section, you can propose the kind of programming that you think would be beneficial to the bar and in particular your generation of lawyers, and you can put that on. You can do something like this for the benefit of the entire profession. It just takes planning. You can make it happen.
And be patient. There are older lawyers above you. They've been there for a long time. They deserve the respect that that brings. Kicking and screaming at them that they're not doing this is not going to get it done. It's going to get
The conference will expire momentarily.
Make sure that as you venture down that road, you are being helpful and not obstructive, because at some point those things are going to get handed over to the next generation of attorneys. And it's up to us what kind of training we expect to be giving to our compatriots and our peers.
I've been involved in a lot of sections with the bar. And
The
they're always
conference
open
has
to
expired.
ideas. Of course, be respectful, but I'm an older member of the bar, and I would welcome great ideas like this. Any other questions?
I had a question for Major Davis. So when you have someone who's coming into jail and they are addicted to heroin or something, and they're going through withdrawals, what exactly does the jail do? Do these people, some of them die while they're in jail? And I actually had another question. Are the inmates that have a mental health problem, are they bullied or targeted by the other inmates? And if so, are they like sequestered to a different spot, or how do you guys deal with that stuff?
First of all, those that are coming in that have an addiction, depending on what kind of treatment plan is already in place in terms of their family and the support, that's going to make a difference. If someone is having a problem and they're already on a narcotic, because we don't allow, we will continue under the doctor's orders and very closely monitor that. But if they're not, and let's say they're having a problem with opioids and want to do Suboxone, we banned it from our jail so that they can't even get it, because unfortunately the passing it off, the exposure that other people have, using it as a money source, we don't allow it. Bullied? No, I really haven't seen that as an issue. It's usually they're left alone, and oftentimes the behavior, whether we're doing the right thing or not, oftentimes that behavior has us moving them into an isolation situation. So they're isolated away from others. So we end up being the practitioners of the same thing that we're opposed to, but for their safety and security, we will move them into a place where they're isolated. So they're not a victim, but also they're not victimizing anyone else. But then we're not giving them the medication that they need, so it becomes a vicious circle and cycle.
And isolation is one of the worst things you can do for someone with mental illness.
Yes, but our folks, it's called acting out. If their symptoms aren't fully under control, they engage in a form of behavior or conduct that breaks rules. And in the state prison system, it's called administrative segregation. You broke the rule, go into solitary. And
for example, Timothy Suter.
Yeah.
Timothy Suter, a young man, he was he stole a toy gun or something, and he's faced off with the police. He asks the cop to shoot him. The cop refuses, takes him to jail instead. Now, this is, remember, Patrick, he got to go to the hospital. Well, Timothy Suter got to go to jail. He gets in jail, kidnapped and searched very well, apparently, had a knife, cuts up a bed sheet, and tries to hang himself. He's unsuccessful. So he's charged with malicious destruction of property, bed sheet. He's sent to state prison, given a 2-year sentence. And of course, he doesn't comply with the rules because he has a mental illness that doesn't allow him to do that. So he's placed in solitary confinement, strapped to a steel bed, where he lays and dies of dehydration. And the video camera shows him falling off of the steel slab at his moment of death. If you want to watch the video, it's online, actually. Before I get into another case out of Virginia where a young man was 19 years old, arrested for stealing $5.05 worth of candy from a store. He thought it was his relative's store. He's arrested, jailed. he is determined incompetent to stand trial, which means he must now be sent to some place that will hold him and treat him. Trouble is, there's no beds available, so he stops eating and drinking. 4 months later, he dies from dehydration. There are mentally ill prisoners in America today dying in prison almost on a daily basis. I mean, I remember I was at the Mental Health Commission in 2004, and I was a little more outspoken then. But I compared Michigan's prison system with mentally ill as approaching something like a Soviet gulag if you're mentally ill. So we don't address mental illness the way we should.
And just to add to this discussion, there have been stories in the paper, and there are ongoing protests at the Macomb County Jail because a couple of people I think now have died as a result of opiate withdrawal in the Macomb County Jail, and there are other stories that's happening around the country. Conventional wisdom is that you can't die from opioid withdrawal. That basically it's horrible, miserable, awful, but you don't need special medications, and you don't. I mean, with alcoholism or benzodiazepine, if you're withdrawing from that, you need anti-seizure medication because it could kill you without, depending on the intensity of the addiction. But the opiates, no, don't need to worry about that. But if you're a person who's already physically weakened and you're going through the intensity of those withdrawals, you could have a heart problem, or what happened, in my understanding, with respect to the jail situation, dehydration. Because you're doing an awful lot of throwing up and coming out of both ends sort of thing. And if you're not monitored, you could die of dehydration. So that's happened before. And this kind of gets into something that you had mentioned, Major Davis, earlier about jails not really being equipped to be the treatment providers. I mean, you do have medical people on staff, but to expect them to be able to medically detox people and knowing when they're supposed to identify these kind of things happen because these people shouldn't be there withdrawing from medications.
And what a terrible position you would put your staff in. I mean, the horrific responsibility of some of these things that they're not specially trained for, that they're forced into. We have a question back here?
Yes, this is another one for the Major. You said there were around 600 inmates in the Ingham County Jail. I was just wondering if you could give us a breakdown on what fraction of those are there for drug offenses, typically, if you know.
We just put this together, and so I'm going to be kind of quoting kind of offhand a little bit, but probably about 30%. Okay. And that's for the drug offense itself.
Right.
All right. Probably a much higher number in terms of underlying causes. Someone is in for retail fraud, okay, but they have a drug addiction and they were stealing at Myers because they want to, get this stereo to sell so they can get their drugs, all right? But they were arrested for retail fraud.
Do they put in the report like this person was on drugs or when they committed this theft or whatever? So is there a way for you guys to track whether or not?
The arresting officer is going to put down retail fraud. If there is some other indicator that they were on drugs or whatever, if they come in and they're, hallucinating or whatever, then we go and have a tox screen done, etc. Then we're going to know that. And we're going to pass that information on to our medical department, and then our medical department is going to try to the best of their ability with the 600 other inmates who have varying problems, because we have juveniles at our facility and we have geriatrics at our facility, and all of the problems that come with that. And my medical staff is 8 strong, so 8 of those and 1.5 mental health there, and then 80 deputies who have minimal training. So we can be alerted to it, but again, unfortunately, my primary concern is custody and security, and the safety of the inmates and the safety of the deputies. And the safety of the inmates is making sure one doesn't harm another and one doesn't harm themselves. However, we don't see this is being real, we don't see our problems dealing with their mental health issues, keeping them safe as long as they're there. But we're not going to let the drugs come in that might help them.
You had spoken about there are places where people can go, but those places get to decide if they're going to choose. How many places are there like that within Michigan? Like Woodland Correctional Facility, I think they deal with mental health issues. How many places are there where people can go? And like you have 1.5 people that deal with mental health. Does anyone know how they're staffed?
Well, we have a Community Corrections Advisory Board that's responsible for helping us find those placements. Sometimes the courts will tell us, they want someone to go to CPI or KPEP or wherever they want them to go. But we don't staff them. We can't force them to take the inmates. We have a couple that will come right to our facility, pick them up, take care of them. But the aftercare, if we release someone, and this is another thing, someone comes in and maybe they're having some treatment and we release them, go to another facility. Let's say they're going off to prison. They don't necessarily take the medication. They won't allow the medication to come in because they go through a period of time at their RGC, their guidance center. So they do their own assessment and own evaluation, and so they won't take the medication. So there's no continuation of care. So the system is fraught with all kinds of things to stop it from being a success. And again, each one is trying to protect their own entity. We know facilities that are out there, but the whole panel can speak to the fact even when at the forensic center, trying to get someone determining either competent to stand trial or just having evaluation. That's problematic in and of itself. And I know you folks can speak to it much better than I. But we'll have people sitting in Ypsilanti for a long time. I did have a person who was not competent to stand trial. They didn't have a placement for them, and they stayed in the jail for 9 months. What the judge finally decided was that I can't get them placement, but I am going to release them because by the time they would be declared competent to stand trial, the length of time that they would have been sentenced for the original crime is less than the time that they've already been in jail. So we end up releasing someone, but where do they go now? Because they're no longer our problem, and yet they still need some help. And you guys,
one of the things that impinges on this is Medicaid. That there are federal rules. It's not something Michigan decided by itself. Medicaid won't pay for on-site health services in a setting of incarceration. If you can get the person off-site, then if you're dealing with Medicaid-eligible providers, etc. But not only does that create a huge problem for the major, but you may have someone who would be Medicaid eligible who winds up incarcerated. Is anyone getting them Medicaid eligible for the day that they'll come out? You also may have some people that come into incarceration who were at that moment in Medicaid, but there has to be an annual redetermination. So whether it's a lengthy stay at a local jail or you're getting into state prison with multi-year stays, has Medicaid been lost? And then when the major or someone else is, John Doe's about to be released, let's try and get help in the community. The first thing a lot of the community agencies ask is, what's the insurance? Oh, no Medicaid? Well, we have so little money in community mental health in Michigan that's general fund money, that's not connected to Medicaid, that, and as Judge Mack told you, the model became, not just in Michigan, but across the country, Medicaid dominated. Oh, Medicaid won't pay for it? Well, how can we get out of doing anything?
Well, you think about our system. Our system has state-imposed poverty. So we had a fellow who attended our mental health commission meetings in 2004. Long history of mental illness and substance abuse. He finally got straight, but he couldn't get a job. Not because he couldn't work, not because he didn't want to work, not because nobody would hire him, not because he wasn't talented, but if he got a job, he would lose his Medicaid coverage. So for those who did recover, we have state-imposed poverty. So then the Forensic Center, I had a meeting with Forensic Center directors from around the Midwest, and every Forensic Center in the Midwest is full, actually all across the country. And what's happening, the delays you're seeing in Michigan are happening all across the country. And so the Forensic Centers are all full. They're spilling over to what we're now called civil beds. This is something new this year, actually, where we're calling the public psychiatric beds outside the correction system civil beds. Well, the forensics people are taking up half the civil beds now. So people who are in need of civil commitment, they can't get in the hospital either. So the system is just crashing.
Is it this way all around the country?
Yes, everywhere.
Nobody's finding.
But we are one of the lowest states in the per capita number of state-operated psychiatric hospital beds. Again, it has been a trend all over the country, but we have one of the, if you, matter of interpretation, we have one of the lowest, poorest per capita state-operated bed availability. We're at maybe in the bottom 5.
Oh, yeah.
But we shifted it to the prisons where they go without care.
Yeah, some people call it trans-institutionalization. It's just we had people institutionalized in one place, and certainly in some cases it wasn't automatically a good thing. And as we got more and more modern and more into community services, in some cases they could have been perhaps better served in the community. But looking at the big picture, we've just shifted one type of institution to another. And consistent with what the major said, I think Los Angeles County Jail is the biggest psychiatric institution in the country.
I want to pipe up here with something that was said a little bit earlier by the major, sort of tie into something that you said about not giving medications in the jails, right? Like the various addiction medications, that kind of thing. So here's just one other, as you're getting all of this, one other crazy thing that's happening. Our federal government has for some time now been relying on science, and the doctors and have been pointing to the researchers that medication-assisted treatment is where it's at for opioid addiction. Methadone or buprenorphine is where you should go. Don't try to go the abstinence route because the failure rate is huge. People are relapsing right and left. And once you get on this maintenance medication, which is now the gold standard for addiction recovery from opioids, stay on it, stay on it, stay on it, stay on it. So someone is trying to do this. They go to an addiction doctor, says, this is what you should do. They say, okay, that's what I'm going to do. They're taking their Suboxone and regularly. Something happens that caused them to be in the jail system. They're put in jail, and guess what? You don't get your Suboxone. Well, it's an opiate. Guess what's going to happen to you now? Horrible physical withdrawal symptoms right there in the jail because you are not allowed to have your medication that you've been taking because you think this is the way you're supposed to be recovering. Your doctors told you that, and now suddenly you're going to be going through opiate withdrawal in the jail system, sick as a dog, rolling around on the floor of the cell. So messed up.
Yeah. One more question. Is that a state law or a federal law that prohibits medications being prescribed in jail?
Say, what was it again?
Is that a state law or a federal law that prohibits inmates to receive their medications in jail?
Well, I don't know this. I don't think it's a federal law. I'm not even sure. It's
No, there's
there's no
law. But I can tell you, in 35 years of doing the work I've done, one of the most common complaints from family members, and it's not necessarily related to opioids, is, and hopefully it's improving some nowadays, but my loved one has been busted, is in the so-and-so jail, and they won't they won't take the medications I've gathered up that he's been taking for mental illness. And at least in older times, there used to be a definitive delay in you were on something, and at best there's going to be a delay of X number of days before it can resume. And I don't know how big a problem that might be in your jail right now, But
See, the Wayne County Jail is the largest psychiatric hospital in Michigan. They have a psychiatric ward. They have $6 million in general fund money per year that goes into that because you can't spend Medicaid dollars there.
Right.
So they treat patients with mental illness in the Wayne County Jail. And in fact, I tried to recruit the director of mental health to be the Wayne County sheriff because I said that's really your job. And being mental health director of the state of Michigan would qualify you to run the Wayne County Jail.
I don't believe my question was answered. What law prohibits?
They don't think there is a law.
It's a safety and security
because
issue.
of competing interests.
It's a local practice.
Okay.
the closest thing to a law would be, again, Medicaid won't pay for on-site health services. And I don't know technically how they react to medications. But I think at least historically, jails used to worry about, I don't know what these medications are. And, I don't know what the rest of the prisoners are, even if they're not controlled substances. Hey, the rest of the prisoners might be salivating, getting a hand on trying somebody's Prozac or somebody's Abilify. These aren't controlled substances.
But it's not a federal law. It's not a state statute.
No, state law doesn't say you cannot prescribe and distribute medications in jails or prison.
So it's the Ingham County Jail that created the rule.
It's across the state of Michigan. It's not just Ingham County. I chair the state jail administrators, and it's across the state. You don't allow them in because of the ability or inability to control aspirin. It's like you're saying. What's good for one inmate isn't necessarily good for another, and inmates share. They pass stuff, they barter it, and if someone has not been medically evaluated to determine whether or not they can have X drug, and then someone gives it to them, and we end up with deaths in our jails. And the liability is reduced significantly by us not allowing it in. Now, does that hurt those who need it? Absolutely. What our medical staff is trying to do, to the best of their ability, is evaluate what's coming in. And I know my medical staff wants to oftentimes, and I don't know what would be a replacement, but if they Suboxone, what might be a step down or whatever, try to determine. Medical department has tried to look at weaning people off of stuff. Oftentimes there's a conflict with our mental health division, because our mental health division is saying we need to maintain this, and the medical department is saying we need to wean them off, or we need to give them a substitute drug. I've had some issues with my medical department because I understand, and they understand, that some prescribed drugs you don't do the generic, and just because the body it doesn't work, and yet the prescribed one is a Schedule 2 or whatever it is, and it can't be in the jail. So we'll sometimes have an inmate in, and we'll put them in administrative segregation, not because they're being punished, but because they need the medication, but we can't have them exposed to other inmates that they might pass that medication on. So then we end up with some civil rights concerns there in terms of that. We fight an easier battle by not having drugs in and talking about safety and security, and then not dealing with the needs of the individual inmate.
See, the jail is not the right place for people with mental illness. So I like to tell a story of the two fishermen. And they're sitting on the bank of the river, and they're fishing. And they see a basket go by with a baby in it. They jump in and go and rescue the baby, bring it ashore. And then about 15 minutes later, comes another baby in a basket floating down the river. The fishermen jump back in and go rescue the baby. And 15 minutes later, there's two baskets coming down the river. One fisherman jumps in the water to go rescue the baby. The other guy gets up and starts walking up the street. Says, "Where are you going? Aren't you going to save these babies?" Now I'm going to find who's throwing the babies in the water. Well, what we should be doing is we should be treating mental illness before people get involved in the criminal justice system. And there's lots of warning. In all the cases I heard, I'd ask people when they came into my court, well, so when did they stop taking his medicine? Oh, 4 months ago. There's plenty of warning. We know what's going to happen. The families have to wait. Wait until the child gets arrested. Then something happens, but in the meantime, they end up in jail. So if you change the standard for intervention so that you can intervene when the person becomes incapacitated, you're, first of all, not as bad off at that point, so the opportunity to get them well faster is better, and their recovery is better, the resiliency is preserved. I think it's constitutional, and I think we should lead the way and get it done.
I think it starts in schools with education, because there was a lot of discussion today about the public response and the stigma, and people, don't want to acknowledge, want to deny that this is going on, and they don't want to deal with it. And if we're ever going to change that, we have to start teaching our kids very early in the curriculum that we are responsible for each other in this world, that we are a community, and we have to have sensitivity training where we teach our youth the importance of being respectful, non-judgmental, and helpful. How can I help? How can I help? And we have this very kind of, it's all about me society. And we could start with these kids and maybe turn the tide on the type of citizen that we produce that then is there to respond and assist rather than ignore and bury.
Major, can I ask you a question? If someone comes into your if someone comes into your jail who's a diabetic who needs insulin, do they get their insulin?
We give them insulin.
So see,
Immediately, or does there have to be a new medical?
let me finish. So basically, if someone's got addiction and they are not necessarily struggling. Let me just start with the addiction part. And they're struggling. It's not that they're struggling with ongoing mental illness, so to speak, because they basically have been told by their doctor that taking Suboxone is how you manage it, right? So they're planning to follow their doctor's advice and take Suboxone long term, maybe for years. That's how they're managing their addiction. They're going about their life, etc. They end up in jail for some other reason. To me, that's sort of tantamount to insulin for a diabetic. I mean, if you take away their Suboxone, that is how they're managing their recovery.
But insulin's not scheduled too.
That's true.
Well, that was another great guest this week on the Law School Insider. If you have an interest in being a guest on the show, drop me an email at lawschoolinsider@Cooley, COOLEY.edu. And thank you all for listening today, and remember, you have the ability and right to take control of your law school's success. I hope you'll continue listening, creating a plan for success that will prepare you to achieve the dreams that you have set for yourself. Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. You're on your way to being a Law School Insider. Please subscribe to stay connected and come back again next time as we speak to more students, lawyers, and employers.